Audio check. Okay, good afternoon everyone. Welcome back. So to kick off this afternoon, we've got Paul Hoggett via Teams. If you can switch your camera on, please, sir. Oh, not, okay.
Right, okay, it looks like I need to download something to be seen, so you probably just have to hear me.
We can hear you, we just can't see you, so if you're happy to proceed just via audio, so we're happy.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. You'll lose nothing by not being able to see me. Okay. As a former professor of social policy at the University of the West of England in Bristol, I remember teaching students during the Blair and Cameron administrations of the importance of evidence-based policy making and the crucial distinction between espoused policy, i.e. policy rhetoric, and policy in use, what governments actually do. Since retirement, I've become increasingly preoccupied with the conundrum of climate change, where, despite the mounting evidence demonstrating the danger of climate change, policy in use remains largely unaffected. The expansion of Bristol's airport is a perfect example of this. Of course, the problem is not just confined to policymakers. It is something that affects all of us when dealing with imminent threats. With a background in psychology, I've sought to examine how and why it is that we can know something and yet not actually believe what we know, thus leaving our knowing strangely dissociated from our doing. Good example of this is cigarette smoking. Most people in the UK who smoke heavily know of the scientific evidence that smoking impacts upon health and increases mortality. Some acknowledge the danger and accept the risk because of the enjoyment smoking brings. But many more are in denial because they lack the courage to imagine the likely consequences of their behaviour. Perhaps because they hold on to the illusion that they're invulnerable. So let's look at one aspect of the scientific evidence relating to climate change, which is particularly pertinent to the county Somerset, in which Bristol Airport is located. Besides Lincolnshire and parts of East Anglia, Somerset contains the largest area of low-lying land in the United Kingdom. It is often overlooked, but just 12,000 years ago, almost all of what we now call the Bristol Channel was a large flat valley which met the sea in a line roughly between Hartland Point and Tenby. As the Ice Age ended and the sea levels rose, so the sea encroached to where it is today. But this was not always a smooth process of encroachment. Evidence suggests that the Great Flood of 1607 inundated low-lying parts of Somerset up to 22.5 kilometres inland. It resulted in the largest loss of life from a natural catastrophe in Britain in the last 500 years. Although some have thought that this was the result of a tsunami, most of the research evidence suggests that it was the conjunction of tidal peaks and the storm surge that was responsible. I'm saying all this to dispel any assumptions that the landscapes and contours of Britain that we all know and love are enduring semi-eternal givens. To the contrary, history shows us the fragility of what we might otherwise take for granted. And so to the present day. Bristol Airport stands above Ken and Nailsea Moors, much of which is less than 5 metres above sea level, as is much of lowland Weston-super-Mare and further south, vast stretches of the Somerset levels. As you're no doubt aware, scientists are unable to predict the exact future impact of climate change, so they've developed a number of scenarios. The current 6th assessment report offers 5 such scenarios, which vary according to the range and intensity of likely impacts. The most pessimistic of these, RCP 845, was intended to explore the most high-risk future. This was regarded as an unlikely scenario. However, in recent years, because climate reality has perversely confounded science's assumptions, this scenario has increasingly been referred to as the most probable business as usual outcome in the absence of stringent climate change mitigation. Perhaps the most significant assumption to have been confounded by nature concerns ice sheet instability and melt rates and the impact on global sea level rise. A research team examining the impact of climate change on global sea level rise, which was led by Professor Jonathan Bamber at Bristol University, concluded in 2019, "We find it plausible that sea level rise could exceed 2 meters by 2100 for our high temperature scenario, roughly equivalent to business as usual." They added, "A sea level rise of this magnitude would clearly have profound consequences for humanity." The likely local impact was spelled out in the 2018 Met Office report, based on extrapolations from this scenario, which projected that sea level rise in the Bristol Channel area could be as high as 1.13 meters by early 2100. Add to this the increased risk of storm surges as climate change deepens, and we have a deeply worrying outlook for low-lying areas in the Bristol Channel. To return to where I began, why is it so difficult for policymakers to believe what the science is telling us? Why is it so easy for all of us to dismiss the deepening concern of this science community as alarmism or doom-mongering? Why this failure of the imagination? So let us just think ahead 30 years to the year 2050. Science tells us that in the absence of stringent mitigation with continued business as usual, for example, with airports allowed to expand willy-nilly in the UK and across the globe, the sea defences between Clevedon and Bridgewater will have to cope with a sea level rise of nearly 0.5 metre. What are the consequences and costs of adaptation? Are these being included in the calculus of costs and benefits regarding airport expansion? And say there are serious storm surges coincided with spring tides. Are such risks being included in the calculus? And which communities are most at risk? One only has to glance at the social geography of Clevedon or Weston-super-Mare to know the answer. The wealthy live on high ground and the less well-off live on the flats below. And of course, in microcosm, this captures the global situation where it is the least well-off who are already suffering the consequences of climate change. To conclude, those who support the expansion of Bristol's airport are like those heavy smokers who cling to their illusions and are unable to get real. To avoid such destructive behaviour, we have to project ourselves into the future and imagine the consequences of our actions. Otherwise, climate change mitigation will simply remain an espoused policy rather than something policymakers actually believe in. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoggett. Thank you. Okay, then next up we have Dan Lundt.
Hello there, good afternoon.
Hello, welcome, sir.
Thank you. So I thought I'd start off just with a brief introduction to myself. So I'm a professor of climate science at the University of Bristol. I've been at the university for 18 years, since doing a PhD in meteorology at Reading and a degree in physics before that at the University of Oxford. I am a lead author on the recent United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, report that came out last month. And I thought it would be useful there would be some useful context for the inquiry that I'd like to highlight some of the findings from this recent IPCC report that are relevant. So I'll start with a brief introduction to the IPCC and then make 3 points, which in brief are firstly to remind the inquiry of the UK's obligation under the Paris Agreement to limit warming to well below 2 degrees and preferably to 1.5 degrees. Secondly, to make the point that the science shows that every ton of carbon that is emitted increases temperatures. And that in order for us as a nation to reach our Paris obligations, the report shows that immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions are needed. Increases in emissions take us further from these targets that are enshrined in law. The science shows that, and the third point I'd like to make is that the science shows that additional warming means additional risks and impacts associated with climate change, including flooding, sea level rise and heat waves. There is a marked difference between, for example, 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. In other words, every bit of warming counts. So, first of all, a bit more background to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in this report. It's a United Nations body set up to provide policymakers, like yourselves, with assessments of the science related to climate change, its impacts and future risks on about a 7-year cycle. The most recent report, the 6th Ipcc assessment report, came out on the 9th of August this year. It's written by over 200 scientists from more than 60 countries around the world. The report received over 78,000 review comments and has been approved by the governments of the United Nations, including the UK. So the first point I'd like to make, like I said, is about the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement is a legally binding international treaty on climate change. It was adopted by 196 parties at the COP21 meeting in Paris on 12th of December 2015 and entered into force in November 2016. Its goal is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. And the UK has signed up to this agreement. Now, 1 or 2 degrees, it might not sound like a big number, but just to put that into context, it is a large number in a climatological sense. To put it into context, the last ice age, about 20,000 years ago, was only about 5 degrees colder than modern. And this was a time when much of the UK was covered with 1 kilometre of ice. So in other words, we've already warmed by about 1 degree over the last 150 years. So that is equivalent to 20% of an ice age. That, we've compressed effectively thousands of years into just a few decades. The second point I'd like to make is that every ton of carbon is important for the future. The report states, and I quote, "This report reaffirms with high confidence that there is a near linear relationship between cumulative anthropogenic CO2 emissions and the global warming they cause. This means that every ton of CO2 emitted leads to additional warming." The report also states, and again I quote, that this relationship implies that reaching net zero anthropogenic CO2 emissions is a requirement to stabilize human-induced global temperature increase at any level. In other words, this means that we need to achieve net zero in order to stop the Earth warming. The report goes on to state that in order to stay below 1.5 degrees warming, so the Paris Agreement, by the end of this century, we need to achieve net zero by 2050. This means that to reach this target agreed by the UK, we need to cease emissions by 2050. The message from the report is unless there are immediate, rapid and large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees will be beyond reach. The third point I'd like to make is that any amount of additional warming leads to additional impacts associated with climate change. The message of the report is that recent changes in the climate have been widespread rapid, and are intensifying, and are themselves unprecedented in thousands of years at least. It is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, and human influence is making extreme climate events more severe. And the key thing, like I said, is that every bit of warming counts. The report states, and again I quote, that every additional 0.5 degrees C of global warming causes clearly discernible increases in the intensity and frequency of hot extremes, including heat waves, heavy precipitation, as well as agricultural and ecological droughts. It goes on to say that additional warming is projected to further amplify permafrost thawing, loss of seasonal snow cover, of land ice, and of Arctic sea ice. At 2 degrees C of global warming, heat extremes would more often reach critical tolerance thresholds for agriculture and health. And it is clear again in the report that impacts will be felt in the UK. The report shows that extreme precipitation and flooding is projected to further increase at global warming of 1.5 degrees. More locally, sea level rise is of crucial concern in Somerset, including, of course, in Weston-super-Mare. A study in 2013 by Quinn et al. From our department in the university showed that 1 metre sea level rise, that with a 1 metre sea level rise, the hazard was of the order at least 10 million per year in North Somerset. Bear in mind that this is a 2013 report. And 1 metre sea level rise, we just heard from the previous speakers, where we could be by 2100. But the key thing, and again, to reiterate what the previous speaker says, the science shows that the most severe impacts will be felt by the most vulnerable in the world, whereas it is the developed world, us, that contribute by far the most to the emissions that cause these impacts. That is the injustice of climate change. However, there is hope for the future. By reducing, not increasing, our carbon footprint, a difference can be made, not only locally, where, as I've said, these impacts will be severe, but globally, and for the most vulnerable in our society. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lundt. If you haven't already, can you submit your transcript to the programme officer, please? Okay, thank you. Okay, next up then, for Ecotricity, we have Mr. Remamwala. So, hello, sir, welcome. I think you're on mute, sir. There we go.
Hello, good afternoon.
Hello.
Well pronounced, the surname to start with. So, yeah, good afternoon. My name is Asif Remamwala. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Ecotricity Group Limited. Today I'm making a statement on behalf of our founder and owner, Dale Vince. Before I make the statement, Dale would like to pass on his apologies for not being able to make the statement in person. So I'm now going to make the statement on his behalf. So my name is Dale Vince, and I'm the founder and owner of the Green Britain Group. Our principal operations are in the sectors of energy, transport and food. We're based in Stroud, just north of Bristol. The first element of the group, Ecotricity, was formed just over 25 years ago. We've grown in that time from scratch to an annual turnover of 280 million, with an EBITDA of 59 million and 83 million pounds of net assets. We employ about 800 people. We operate a no-fly policy. I speak to you today as somebody that knows how business works. You will hear from the other participants in the course of this inquiry about the climate crisis and the role that flying plays in that, the urgent need to reduce our emissions, and how airport expansions runs wholly counter to that and is thus inimitable to our international obligations under the Paris Accord and our own legally binding zero carbon targets as a country. We need to fly less, not more. That's a fact. But I want to talk to you from a business perspective. The expansion of Bristol Airport makes no commercial sense. I offer you two reasons. The first is an effect of the pandemic. Pre-pandemic, we chose to use technology for meetings and for participation in conferences and discussion. It was not always a popular choice with organisers. The first time we did this with the UEFA, the Union of European Football Associations, 3 years ago, they were reluctant. The experience was good though, and UEFA have embraced this approach. It's the new normal. The pandemic forced this kind of participation on all of us and showed us the benefits of it. I can take part in multiple events all over the globe in the same day without leaving my office. The savings in travel time and costs, the improvements in efficiency are simply too considerable to ignore. I believe, based on my own experience, that there has been a fundamental shift of business attitude away from flying towards digital participation. And for this reason, there will be less demand at Bristol Airport in the future than there was pre-pandemic. My second reason is linked to the climate crisis and our zero carbon commitments. It's an economic argument though. It can only be a matter of time now before politicians grasp the nettle of flying and the extraordinary tax-free status airports is taken away. Duty-free fuel will be a thing of the past, adding considerable cost to flying. It's entirely conceivable that there will be a tax on flying beyond the imposition of fuel duty, a carbon tax. Flying's special status in our economy will not endure the next few years of intense carbon policy scrutiny. Flying today is artificially cheap in the extreme. That will come to an end soon. When it does, there will be a further drop in demand for flights. This proposed expansion is an idea overtaken by global events, the climate crisis, and the pandemic-inspired shift to digital participation in the pursuit of efficiency. If it goes ahead, it will become a stranded asset and a monument to a lack of vision and inability to change direction. Bristol Airport's published plan to be carbon neutral is the ultimate in greenwashing. It excludes the emissions from flying. You can have no better or authoritative confirmation that flying is incapable of reconciliation with notions of carbon reduction than this from Bristol Airport. They cannot deal with the emissions from flying themselves, and so they exclude them from their plan. I urge you to reject this expansion of airport capacity as a bad business idea. I thank you for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you very much. And if it hasn't been submitted already, if the transcript can be sent into the programme officer, that would be helpful to us. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, I have Patrick Hart on my list. Yeah, welcome, sir.
Hi. So, my name is Dr. Patrick Hart, and I'm a local Bristol GP. I grew up in the West Country, and I plan to spend my career serving the people here. I'm here today to talk to you about Bristol Airport expansion in the context of the climate crisis, but also in the context of a health crisis. When I started thinking about what I would say, I thought there's a risk that I might sound like I'm speaking in hyperbole. It might sound shocking. So I wanted to begin by assuring you that it is not. It is just the facts. My only motivation for coming here today is a deep concern for my patients and a duty to act for their well-being. I'm here in my own time, and when I leave, I shall be returning straight to work. So the facts. The fact is, the climate crisis is making us sick. It's making us sick, and it is making the planet sick. It's making us sick, and it is killing us. Us, our children, and children yet to be born. Killing us. I don't want you just to take my word from it. First of all, I was hoping to read a joint letter by hundreds of healthcare professionals who've come together through an organisation called MedAct, working in and around the local area. We call on you to commit to preventing the expansion of Bristol Airport. We detail specific health concerns below. 1. Air quality. Increasing capacity at Bristol Airport will involve increased emissions from aeroplanes and increased emissions from vehicular transport to and from the airport. Together, these will worsen air quality in the Bristol area. We can expect that surface emissions will be increased by 9,500 additional vehicle movements per day. That is 13,000 to 28,000 private vehicle journeys per day to and from the airport. Premature deaths, of which an estimated 16,000 a year globally are attributable to aviation emissions, are mostly due to the particulates and ozone released during takeoff and landing, and we have a reference for that. For those populations who live within 20 kilometres of an airport, an estimated 5,000 people will suffer a premature death due to aviation emissions. A study by the King's College of London examined the public health implications of air pollution from particulate matter and nitrogen dioxide and found evidence of decreased life expectancy of children born and growing up in high levels of exposure. In adults, exposure to these pollutants is linked to increased risk of heart and lung disease, including lung cancer, obesity, stroke, asthma, and diabetes. Mental health is also at risk, with a recent meta-analysis concluding that an increase in ambient particulates is strongly associated with increased depression risk in the general population, as well as studies showing a link between poor air quality and dementia. It has been shown that exposure to air pollution in pregnancy can cause low birth weight, in particular fetal head size. Low birth weight is associated with morbidity later in life, such as coronary artery disease, type 2 diabetes, and asthma. These health effects exert an economic toll for individuals, businesses, and health services. In the UK, the costs due to poor air quality are estimated to be more than £20 billion every year. 2. Noise pollution. Under the planned expansion, there would be a flight every 3 minutes, up to 4,000 night flights, and thousands of additional residents being flown over. The World Health Organization recognizes noise as an underestimated threat that has significant public health effects. They advise decibel levels of less than 30 decibels in a bedroom for good quality sleep and less than 35 decibels in a classroom for effective learning. The average decibel level of an aircraft taking off is in the order of 100 decibels. Noise pollution is linked to sleep disturbance and heart disease. Furthermore, it has been shown to have greater effect on the very young. The World Health Organization states there is consistent evidence that noise exposure harms cognitive performance, consistent association with impaired well-being and motivation to a slightly more limited extent, and moderate evidence of effects on blood pressure and catecholamine hormone secretion. The Civil Aviation Authority list stress, annoyance, sleep disruption, and poor performance at school and work as the recognized effects of noise pollution from airports. It is therefore clear that the additional noise pollution generated by increased capacity at Bristol Airport would cause morbidity and premature death for the residents of North Somerset and Bristol. Thirdly, climate change. The negative environmental impacts of the proposed expansion of Bristol Airport are far greater, both in terms of CO2 and non-CO gases, than is stated in the planning application, and would therefore contribute significantly to the climate emergency. The Advisory Committee on Climate Change, CCC, recently stated that the UK's planned increase in aviation needs to be curbed. This expansion directly contravenes this advice. Climate change is the biggest global health threat of the 21st century, according to the Lancet. The WHO predicts that between 2030 and 2050, there will be an additional 250,000 deaths from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and dehydration, directly related to climate chaos. Climate change is also linked to more chaotic extremes, if not only heat, but also rain and therefore flooding. This will lead to more problems with contaminated water sources, diarrheal disease, vector-borne diseases such as malaria, as well as contributing to a situation where food is less abundant and more expensive. The UN has also stated that climate change is putting the food security of billions of people at risk. Furthermore, weather chaos will lead to damage and access difficulties to healthcare bases such as hospitals and GP surgeries, strangling the ability of healthcare workers to deliver efficient care and preventing good access for patients. These wide-ranging issues will have direct and tangible negative effects on local residents. Climate change threatens the health and well-being of people in our community, on our planet, and threatens the very existence of the next generation. In conclusion, we assert that pursuing airport expansion endangers the health and well-being of people in Bristol and North Somerset. We present evidence to show the threats to health caused by three mechanisms relating to the proposed expansion: worsening air quality, noise pollution, and contributions to climate breakdown. We also point out the significant economic costs of these health impacts. We therefore believe there is a moral obligation and duty of care to residents to act now and oppose airport expansion. Many thanks for your consideration. And then I have the signatures of a large number of healthcare professionals going on for several pages, which I can submit. It was timely that, should you still need further persuasion, all of the world's major medical journals published a joint editorial piece just over a week ago, which is unprecedented, really. In this, they again reiterated that climate breakdown is the biggest threat to our health that we face, and possibly have ever faced, and that action to immediately reduce our emissions is the only chance we have of avoiding the misery and death that will result. So, to conclude, we often hear in defense of airport expansion that freedom of movement is our right. And what we all know, but perhaps need to remind ourselves of from time to time, is that with rights come responsibilities. We have responsibilities to our own health. We have responsibilities to the health of one another. And we have a responsibility for the safety and well-being of our children and of the children yet to be born. This is why my right to move freely at 60 miles per hour ends as soon as I enter a residential area. Then my right to move freely at 30 miles per hour ends as soon as I go past a school. Very few of us complain about this imposition on our personal freedoms. We all understand implicitly why it must be so. And so it is for this so-called right to unlimited air travel, and thereby airport expansion. We are now at 1 minute to midnight. The climate crisis is upon us, and if we do not act now and act decisively, it will be too late. To indulge our rights whilst forgetting our responsibilities to one another and to our children will take us over the edge of the cliff. So here it is, the cold, hard facts of the matter. To expand Bristol Airport would be a real, literal death sentence. I don't believe I could be any clearer than that. Thanks for letting me speak today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hart. If you can make a copy of what you've said today available, and I know you said about the signatures as well on that the letter. Thank you. Is there a Pete Brownlee on? Yes. Thank you. We couldn't quite see your name, so you were sort of at the bottom of the screen. So welcome. Thank you.
I'm here. Thank you. And thank you for allowing me to talk today. I'm speaking to you as a resident in Chew Magna. I've lived in Chew Magna at the top of the High Street, the B3130, for over 35 years. And I've seen traffic increase dramatically over that time. I believe that's in a large part due to the growth of the airport. Flights have greatly increased over the years, but because of the lack of a rail or motorway link, many passengers have to rely on private cars and taxis to travel there and back, and the B3130 is the most direct route from Bath and the southwest, connecting the A37 to the A38 and the airport. There are a number of places, including right outside my house, where the road narrows, and often due to a delivery van or parked vehicles, only single file traffic is possible. Queues soon form and drivers unable to pass leads to long lines of stationary cars full of angry, frustrated drivers. Now, this is actually a regular occurrence, with traffic sometimes at a standstill for 15 minutes or more. Last week, it was over half an hour at one point. The vehicle exhausts from such heavy congestion create a very unhealthy environment for pedestrians, especially children, cyclists and other road users. Not to mention the stress for the car users, many trying to get to a flight on time. The same thing regularly occurs at a number of similar pinch points along the B3130, including 500 metres further down the road, right in the centre of Chew Magna, adding to the chaos. And I've seen exactly the same scenario in Winford. I believe you drove around the area at the end of August, partly to see what road conditions were like for yourselves. But you did so when the schools were closed and with the airport running at a much reduced capacity. I don't know what you experienced, but it's unlikely you saw what it's really like. Even a slight increase in traffic or one vehicle in the wrong place can cause complete gridlock. The truth is, our villages are already being choked by traffic, much of it due to passengers using Bristol Airport. I'm glad to hear you're going to be doing further early morning visits to our villages, but if possible, can I please request that you stay around for the morning rush hour when the traffic is often at its worst? At a time when school children are being encouraged to walk and cycle to school, many are. But in Chew Magna, that sometimes means using roads with no pavements. They're faced with the dangers of this extremely busy traffic and the corresponding risks to road safety and health. Of course, not all traffic through Chew Magna is generated by the airport, and it's hard to know exactly how much is. But there was one event that gave me a good idea of how much traffic is directly connected to the airport. You have to take your minds back to 2010 and the Icelandic volcanic eruption in April of that year, which led to the closure of airspace. All planes were grounded, and there was little or no airport traffic, while all other road users were unaffected. During those weeks, I was amazed how much less traffic there was through the village. It was clear to me and my neighbours that airport traffic is a major contributing factor to the congestion in Chew Magna. We also saw that with less traffic, the air felt noticeably cleaner. Now, back in 2010, there were under 6 million passengers. In the years since and up to the pandemic, passenger numbers have, of course, greatly increased, adding to the problem. The two biggest traffic issues for me are the location of the airport in such a rural position and the lack of any rail or motorway connection. Bristol is the only international airport in the country not to have one or other. The airport's suggested plans for slight changes to the road layout at the A38 are completely inadequate and will do nothing to ease the increased pressure on our already congested local routes, including the many pinch points along the length of the B3130. Passenger numbers before the pandemic were nearly 9 million a year. The airport wants to increase that to 12 million. That's a lot more cars. The airport planned to build another large multi-storey car park as part of their expansion. They want to make a lot more space for those extra cars at the airport, but all those cars will have to get there and back, many of them using our narrow village roads where there is already not enough capacity. For this reason alone, I'm against Bristol Airport's expansion. But even more worryingly, I've watched with alarm the increasing climate chaos around the world. I'm a film editor who's worked for the BBC Natural History Unit for over 30 years. In that time, I've edited many wildlife documentaries, including Blue Planet 2, working closely alongside a number of the world's top environmental scientists. For many years now, I've been hearing the same story. They have all been saying how urgently we need to lower carbon emissions because of the damage it's doing to the natural world. And we are part of the natural world. I'm not a scientist, but we can all clearly see that their warnings are already coming true. I've been listening to your speakers today, and how can we not listen to this science? Now, I believe from reading about you that you are scientists, the three investigators. And I think the science is screaming at us right now. And all I can ask is that you please listen. Time is rapidly running out for the situation to be turned round. The important decision you reach at this inquiry can help to set us on the right path, or it could add to the rise in global temperatures and all the impacts that that will have. In their decision last February, the North Somerset councillors took the global crisis into account. They rejected expansion, giving damage to the environment more weight than the advice of their own planning officers. I hope that this inquiry is equally forward-thinking. We live in a world where the environment should be the overriding factor in any business decision. Is a successful business plan really more important than a healthy planet? In conclusion, I feel an expanded airport is not needed. The worse it will be, and worse, it will be damaging both on a local and global level. It will do untold harm to the natural world and the health, well-being and quality of life for us all, our children, and for generations to come. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr. Brownlee. Okay. I've got that one. It's fixed. Right. What about the T? Because that. I think that. Do we have a Tina Kilroy on Teams?
Hello, yes, I'm here.
Hello. I'm going slightly out of order here, but I know you've got a fixed appointment, so if you'd like to start, thank you.
Yeah, okay, my bit's quite short. I'm speaking today to express my concern regarding the planned airport expansion. I'm concerned also, as Pete, about the impact on global and local, at a global and local level. Concerns that address the UK's response to the global climate crisis have been made by others, and so I'm not going to particularly talk about that right now. But I'd like to address the impact of noise and air pollution, particularly arising as a result of air traffic over the area of outstanding natural beauty, which is the Chew Valley. I live in Chewstoke, which isn't on the direct flight path, and yet the noise of the airport traffic is disruptive many times every day. This is because the noise on takeoff and landing is much louder than when planes are in the air. We can hear the planes taking off until they reach the A38, several miles worth of their initial journey. This noise travels further in cooler or stiller conditions and has much more impact in the early morning, evenings, and at night. These are the times when increased plane traffic is likely to occur, and I'm concerned that the airport expansion will disrupt the enjoyment of my home for myself and my family. As well as being in the Greenbelt, part of the Chew Valley is an area of outstanding natural beauty, and within this there are conservation areas. Whilst the airport itself is not within the AONB, aircraft frequently fly over the valley, causing localised noise and air pollution. Planes are still quite low when they fly over the valley, and their noise reverberates throughout. Being in an AONB provides many protections against relatively minor development as an ordinary citizen, like putting up solar panels or a roof light. However, I'm concerned that the impact of substantial development in the sky above us isn't being considered in the current process. The National Planning Framework, Chapter 15, Section 174E, refers to this and says planning policies and decisions should contribute to and enhance the natural and local environment by preventing new and existing development from contributing to or being put at risk of unacceptable levels of soil, air, water or noise pollution. I think this is relevant because the flight paths travel over the AONB. I do have some photographs on my phone which I can send in separately which demonstrate using just an ordinary app the flight paths as they fly over my home. I probably can't see them on the screen here, but I can send them in separately. I would also like to add that the aircraft movements are often far less uniform than their intended flight path suggests. I have observed and can show you examples, again using my app, of aircraft movements which seemingly circle around parts of Bristol and the surrounding area at relatively low levels, causing many more times the amount of noise and air pollution than the airport would probably acknowledge. With more aircraft movements, we can only expect increased frequency of the number of planes that can't make a direct landing. The impact of this additional noise and air pollution needs to be calculated and included in the impact assessment. And again, by which I mean sometimes the aircraft, don't take their ordinary path, but they fly all around other parts of Bristol and surrounding area for reasons I don't understand before they land, and that means that the localised pollution is far higher than you might otherwise expect. Finally, I'd like to add that I've got children that are aged 11 and 14 who are, like many other teenagers their age, extremely worried about climate change and the prospect of ongoing wildfires, floods and sea level rises. It genuinely causes them distress and causes a lot of fighting in our house because they terrorise each other with the prospect of what's to come. They can't understand why more isn't being done to arrest the situation, and this is particularly hard to navigate when they themselves are seeing and experiencing increased air traffic around their own homes, and with the prospect of that only likely to increase as a result of airport expansion. That's all I'd like to say.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, and if you can send through your transcript and anything else, okay, that you referred to.
Yep, I've got
okay. Thank
no
you.
problem.
Thank you very much. Okay. Do we have Samantha Lindo here? No. Okay. All right. Virtually then, have we got Lucienne Green?
Yes, I'm here.
Hello, thank you.
Hi, thank you for having me on. So I live in the Chew Valley area. The fact that an expansion of Bristol Airport is even being considered is quite frankly terrifying. The planet is at a tipping point. All the warning signs are not just flickering, they are burning very brightly. We have a climate crisis, and the reality is that we, that's government and businesses and individuals, all need to cut our emissions by as much as we can and as fast as we can. More airport capacity leads to higher passenger numbers and higher emissions. To pump thousands of extra tons of carbon into the atmosphere for financial gain is therefore utterly reckless. carbon offsetting and aviation technological development have not and cannot keep a pace of current emissions and should not be used as a method for justifying an increase in avoidable emissions. Claims that airport expansion will bring enormous economic benefits are flawed and exaggerated. An article published by the New Economics Foundation during September 2020 stated the following. In 2019, only 15% of UK departures were for international business purposes. Around 75% of departures were for international leisure trips. Of this figure, the majority, 62%, are UK residents, meaning that far more UK residents fly out for leisure than foreign residents fly in. According to the Office of National Statistics, about 30 billion moves out of the economy every year due to international travel. Claims that new airport capacity creates new jobs is also flawed, as the economic value of these jobs is actually wiped out by the cost of the associated carbon emissions. That's if we assume these jobs will ever materialise. Aviation receives tax exemptions, and this acts as a subsidy for growth. As Friends of the Earth have pointed out, if this tax was collected and distributed around the country in proportion to the population, councils would receive millions of pounds. So instead of investing in industries like aviation with low job creation potential and high carbon emissions, surely we should be investing in green infrastructure and green jobs. As I stated, I live in the Chew Valley area, and I have to say that my well-being and health is being seriously impacted by the constant appalling noise and the air pollution from the planes and traffic. And it is also totally unacceptable that yet more green belt land will be consumed by tarmac and buildings. So I will conclude by saying that it is a fact that if the airport is allowed to expand, it will mean that another big nail is hammered firmly into this planet's coffin. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, on Teams again then, do we have Rory Piliza? I believe you're on there. If
Hello?
Hello.
Hi there. Hi, sorry, it's just opening, but yes. Hi, thank you very much for allowing me to speak.
Your camera's not on, sir. We can hear you, but we can't see you. Is that,
Yeah,
is that on purpose?
No, it's not on purpose. It's thinking. My computer's thinking. But yeah, hopefully it'll come on in a second.
Okay. If you keep talking.
Maybe I can start and it'll come on.
If you're happy to, it's not come up yet, but you are audible to everyone, so I'm not sure what's going on. But
no, that's fine. Yeah, that's fine. So yeah, my submission is about the link between climate change and extreme weather events. So yeah, the latest report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Ipcc, states that global warming of 1.5 degrees to 2 degrees Celsius will be exceeded during the 21st century unless deep reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions occur in the coming decades. Clearly, the airport expansion does not constitute a reduction in CO2 emissions. The IPCC states that as the amount of CO2 we emit into the atmosphere increases, so does the global temperature. As global temperatures rise, the likelihood and intensity of extreme weather events increases. As these events become more frequent and intense, they inflict suffering around the world. It is easy to forget that climate change affects people's lives all over the world. I want to remind everyone of the human cost of climate change, and I also want to remind everyone that this airport expansion, therefore, will contribute to suffering around the world. On the 19th of July of this year, the UK Met Office issued its first ever extreme heat warning in the UK. It said, the wider population are likely to experience some adverse health effects, including sunburn or heat exhaustion, dehydration, nausea, fatigue, and other heat-related illnesses. The Ipcc report states that unless we cut our emissions significantly, heat waves that used to occur once every 50 years are predicted to occur once every 3.5 years by the end of the century. These heat waves will also increase in intensity. This airport expansion will contribute to these changes in the climate. Earlier this year, in Germany, over 180 people died in some of the worst floods ever recorded for that region. One rescue worker describes their efforts. We managed to get 50 people out of their houses last night. We know of 15 people who still need to be rescued. One has to assume that, under the circumstances, some people did not manage to escape. A local resident said, it looks like a bomb went off. Everything is destroyed and there's nothing left of the city centre. Climate scientists estimate that the floods were made up to 9 times more likely and 19% more intense due to climate change. The Ipcc report states that unless we cut our emissions dramatically, events of heavy rainfall that used to occur once every 10 years are predicted to occur once every 4 to 6 years. These heavy rainfall events are predicted to increase in intensity by 14 to 30%. The airport expansion will contribute to the suffering connected to these events in the future. In Canada and the US, wildfires have spread uncontrollably, taking lives and devastating whole towns. One Canadian politician said, I've talked to a number of firefighters who said that this year's fires are behaving in a manner that they have never seen before. They're just exceedingly aggressive and it's almost impossible to get ahead of them. Experts have linked the wildfires to brutal heat waves and persistently dry conditions earlier in the summer. Climate scientists state that these heat waves would have been virtually impossible without human-caused climate change. They warn that these wildfires are likely to become more common in the future. This airport expansion will contribute to the suffering brought on by such events. In Peru, climate change has substantially increased the outburst flood hazard from Lake Palcacocha, which threatens approximately 50,000 people in the city of Huaraz. In the event of a flood, the inhabitants would have just 30 minutes to evacuate their homes. Some experts estimate that the death toll from such an outburst would be as high as 20,000. People in the city live in limbo, fearing one day that the floods will wash away their homes. Luciano Zria thinks about the floods every day. His home needs repairs, but he explains, if I said it's a flood zone, I won't fix the house. That would look crazy. But it's also crazy to fix the house, knowing the danger from the floods. From both sides, it's crazy. The extra 1 million tonnes of carbon emissions from the airport expansion would contribute to increased risks of flooding in the future. In 2019, in Northern Australia, at least 23,000 fruit bats died over 2 days as the country experienced record-breaking temperatures of more than 42 degrees Celsius. Body count amounts to about a third of the species' total population in Australia. One wildlife photojournalist described the scene. One falls and the rest cascade to the ground. crushing and suffocating each other. Dozens, if not hundreds, of dead or dying bats at the bottom of the tree. You're looking down at them, and they're looking up at you, gasping. They're smothering and heating up. Volunteers will go in and separate out the bodies and find some that are still alive, but you've got 20 to 30 rescuers and 4,500 bats. It's like a war zone. It's sad and distressing and heartbreaking, and you know that it will happen again and again and again. And the Ipcc report agrees. If we don't change course, this is likely to happen again, again and again. Sadly, some of the effects of climate change are already irreversible, but we still have a chance to stop the worst effects of climate change, and stopping this airport expansion would be a step in the right direction. Finally, in Uganda, Constance Okolet is a climate witness for the United Nations. When she learned that climate change had increased the frequency and intensity of the droughts and floods which devastated her crops and left her community with no food, she said, "I learned that overpollution from developed countries had caused real changes to the climate. I felt bad because I knew that people in developed countries are our friends. We are the same people, we have the same blood. But these people were enjoying their life while we were suffering. I wanted to know why they were doing this to us. I wanted to know whether people in developed countries could reduce their emissions so that we could have our normal seasons back." So Constance wants to know, will we reduce our carbon emissions so that her community can have their seasons back? Stopping this airport expansion would be one step in the right direction, halting the increase in our carbon emissions. This could be a turning point in our story. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, do we have Poppy Brett on Teams?
Yeah, I'm here. For some reason, it's come up as Natasha. I don't know why.
Okay, well, I'm glad you're here anyway.
Which is actually my real name, but I don't really go by it. I go by Poppy.
Okay, is that how you want to be recorded?
Yes, please.
Okay,
yeah.
That's fine. Thank you.
So I've lived in Bristol for 26 years, and I'm not someone who normally speaks at public inquiries. But I'm here because I am deeply worried about the future of the planet. And much of what I have to say comes from the heart, but I will do my best to explain why I believe the plans to expand Bristol Airport should not be approved. And I will refer to relevant conflicts in government policy in doing so. We are facing an unprecedented climate emergency. We have known about it for a long time. When I was just 17, I read a report that had been published by President Jimmy Carter a few years earlier in 1980 about the state of the world environment. And even then, he was calling for the world to unite and act. But humanity failed to take the threat seriously. And the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report warns that global warming, rising sea levels, and extreme weather events are now inevitable, and a continued failure to act will have catastrophic consequences. The UK has enshrined in law under the Climate Change Act of 2008 legally binding targets to reduce emissions. Now, I'm not a statistician or a climate scientist, but common sense alone tells me that airport expansion means increased emissions. Increased emissions from both aviation and associated car journeys. However you look at it, whatever arguments are made and put forward by the airport's environmental impact assessment team trying to justify expansion, they cannot claim a reduction in emissions. On the 27th of June 2019, net zero became law, requiring the UK to reduce net emissions of greenhouse gases to zero by 2050. The only path forwards for Bristol Airport, therefore, is that they A, should not expand, and B, that they should actually reduce current emissions over a sustained period of time in order to meet net zero by 2050. For individual schemes like this, carbon is often taken to be close to irrelevant in the context of all emissions. Project promoters often argue that the law doesn't apply to them. But when this assumption is made incrementally across the whole transport sector, aviation, roads, HS2, etc., the cumulative impact is vast. The prospect of keeping temperature increases within safe limits will be destroyed, and so the expansion must not be allowed, and the law should apply to individual projects. Without this, the law is pointless. The expansion of the airport will also have a huge impact on the already fragile local transport system, generating a huge number of additional car journeys. As someone who enjoys leisure cycling, I am concerned about the impact on the Avon Cycleway, which crosses the A38 to the east of the airport. It's an 80-mile circular route, mainly using quiet lanes and traffic-free routes. And when it was set up over 30 years ago, traffic in the area was light, but successive airport expansions and the current proposals will increase traffic and danger to such an extent that the viability of this valuable community resource, enjoyed by thousands, will be seriously threatened. The Department for Transport Active Travel Policy Gear Change 2020 states, "We will ensure that all new housing and business developments are built around making sustainable travel, including cycling and walking, the first choice for journeys." The airport proposals are in conflict with clearly stated government policy. If you approve this, the airport must provide a safe and attractive alternative route, giving direct, free access to their facility for visitors and staff by bike. Personally, I won't be flying again. On the 9th of August 2021, the day the Ipcc report was published, my 21-year-old said to me, "Mum, you know you're not going to have grandchildren." He explained that he and some of his friends had decided that they couldn't responsibly have children with such a bleak ecological outlook. Whether or not he and his friends have children is irrelevant. At 21, I wasn't even thinking about children. I just assumed I'd have them, and it would be a personal choice based on my circumstance, not a decision I was having to make for humanity. He and his friends shouldn't be discussing children, and the fact that they are having such conversations hides an underlying anxiety about the future and shows that they understand the severity of the issues we face. That they feel they have to take such courageous decisions and make such sacrifices also shows what poor decisions our generation has made and continues to make. And whilst Bristol Airport spends millions on its plans to expand, many young people are not planning their next flights or hoping to go globe-trotting. They are wondering what kind of future they will have. And my decision not to fly feels like a tiny sacrifice in comparison to theirs. And on the same day, my 16-year-old, who has her first cleaning job, asked if I thought the business she cleans for would let her buy refillable cleaning products. And my heart burst with pride at her willingness to play her part, but it burst with sadness at her belief that her actions would make a difference. The actions of individuals will count for nothing if they're not matched by the actions of corporations and governments. And I am sad, frustrated and angry that those in the position to make the difference that counts, to take the decisions that will really have an impact, are prepared to plough on with ecologically damaging, unlawful projects that in the end will serve no one if we destroy the fundamental ecological building blocks for life. This proposal is in conflict with high-level and specific government policies as I outlined. It is also a moral outrage in the midst of a climate emergency, and I strongly urge you to recommend refusal. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brett. Okay, thank you. Okay, in the room, do we have Kathy Fawcett? Yeah, if you'd like to take a seat. Okay, fine. If you could switch the microphone on.
Hello.
Hello.
You can hear me now.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today in person. I'm Kathy Fawcett. I'm a senior lecturer in science communication at the University of the West of England, but I'm speaking here today in a personal capacity. And I'd like to do two things. I'd like to present a letter from myself and other academics, and also to make a brief statement of my own. The letter is jointly signed by 61 academics, including 20 professors and 33 PhD doctors. And it includes Professor Lorraine Whitmarsh from the University of Bath, who's the director of the UK Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations. John Atherton, Professor of Environmental Sustainability at the University of Nottingham. Paula Hill, the Professor of Finance at the University of Bristol. James Dyke, who's Assistant Director of Global Systems Institute at the University of Exeter. Chris Priest, Professor of Sustainability and Computer Systems at the University of Bristol. Professor Mandy Rose from the Documentary and Digital Cultures Unit at the University of the West of England. Phil Goodwin, who is Emeritus Professor of Transport Policy at UCL and UE, University of the West of England. And Professor Richard Pancost, who's head of the School of Earth Sciences at the University of Bristol. And I'm going to read that letter to you now. It's an open letter from concerned academics to the planning inspector regarding Bristol Airport's expansion plans. Dear Inspector, we write this open letter to you on a matter of national and international importance. Bristol Airport's planning appeal to expand their passenger numbers by 2 million a year. We are academics with expertise in climate change, science, impacts and policy, zero carbon futures, the green economy transition, sustainable transport and business, sustainable cities, green energy, sustainable food production, climate change communications, ecological economics, the impact of climate change on mental health, and many other related fields of research. In December 2020, the UK Climate Change Committee published its 6th carbon budget. On aviation, it noted that there should be no net expansion of UK airport capacity, and that the government should reassess its airport capacity strategy in the context of the UK's net zero commitment and any lasting impacts on demand from COVID-19. So in paragraph 2, page 34. On the 18th of March 2020, North Somerset Council Planning Committee rejected a planning application from Bristol Airport. Despite an overwhelming rejection of the plans from local residents and nearly 9,000 formal objections, local councillors on the committee and the damage caused to the airport's business plan by COVID-19, the airport have appealed. We consider that any increase in passenger numbers and flights from Bristol Airport runs contrary to the UK's climate targets and responsibilities to international climate mitigation as per the Climate Change Act of 2008 and the Paris Agreement. In the year that the UK is hosting the COP26 conference, it is vital that the UK shows leadership on climate change and takes the necessary actions to secure a safe, zero-carbon future. We therefore urge you to reject this appeal. So, for my own personal statement, I wanted to talk about my 20 years' experience as an educator and to make really quite a simple appeal, and it's about hope. And it picks up on some of the statements I'd been listening to just now. I have a PhD in ecology, but I went on to become a secondary science teacher, and I was part of the leadership team in a big sixth form on the outskirts of Bristol. I then went on to run the education department at a science centre in the centre of Bristol, and I now teach university students at the West of England, University of the West of England, about science communication. And across my 20 years in education, I've taught learners from age 5 all the way up to adult. And do you know, the issue of climate change has been a constant throughout that time. And I've worked alongside colleagues at all levels who work tirelessly and passionately and creatively to teach an understanding and an awareness of what climate change means for all of us and for all life on Earth. And we're increasingly, and quite rightly, asked to put thinking about sustainability at the heart of everything we do in education. And what we all want is for our students to be informed, to ask questions, to speak up, and to have high expectations and aspirations for themselves and for their future. And this seems absolutely right, doesn't it? Because education actually is about the future. It's an investment, it's a kind of promise to the future. And it now feels as if our job as educators isn't just about that, it's about protecting that future in order for our students to have some hope. And I think a really key point here is that teachers don't really have influence. So they have influence, but they don't really have power. And for that education to really count, there needs to be a coherence between what we teach and what our students observe and experience in the rest of their life. So for all of those ideas about sustainability that we try to teach and model to be visibly and spectacularly ignored elsewhere is a real problem. And it's not like we're saying anything new or anything radical. There's surely nothing substantive that any of us really disagree on here. We know that climate change is happening. We know it's going to be catastrophic. We know it's anthropogenic. And we know that emissions from aviation are part of that damage that's being caused. And the disagreement, it seems to me, really seems to be on the value that we place on that promise to the future that our teachers and educators are making in schools and universities across the country, when it's set alongside more immediate economic interests. And we all know that children notice not just what we say, but also what we do. They watch us closely. And that means that consistency and leadership really matters, whether we define a leader as a parent, a teacher, or a politician. And though politicians are not generally well liked or well trusted, scientists, medical doctors, and significantly teachers are amongst the most trusted professionals in our society. So if what students see is that these trusted adults say one thing and those in power do entirely another, that undermines the work that we do as teachers and educators. It actually damages our professional credibility. And if what they observe instead is the power of cynical short-term interests prevailing, despite all of the damage that we know that those actions will make to the planet, how can they themselves not learn to be cynical? And how can they not learn despair? And how will they stay hopeful for the future? That lack of alignment between the message and the behaviour is so corrosive and so damaging for our young people. And of course, it's never going to be easy for us to step away from doing things the way that we've always done them. But I'm sure that you'll agree that we need to show students of all ages that our generation can make those really hard decisions that make a difference now. And this is one of those hard decisions, and it's going to need real leadership and real courage. And we know that collectively we have a mountain to climb, so maintaining hope while we do that is going to be crucially important. And that's what I'm really here to ask you for, because you have that real power to make good on that promise to the future that teachers everywhere make every day through the work that they do, and in so doing, to allow their students to stay hopeful. So thank you very much for your time today and for the courage and trust that I hope you will be able to bring to your decision making on this really important issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, yeah. Yes, yeah. Oh, right, okay. Okay, thank you. Do we have Polly Denny in the room, please?
Good afternoon, my name's Polly Denny and I'm a resident of Chew Magna and I'm here today speaking on behalf of Maya Rose Craig.
Can you just speak a little bit more into the microphone, please?
Yes, I can.
There's a knack, but thank you.
Is that better?
Yes.
Do you want me to repeat that or is that okay?
No, that's fine.
Okay. This is a transcript of a 3-minute film produced by 19-year-old Dr. Maya Rose Craig, who was awarded a doctorate by Bristol University for her work engaging young people from visible ethnic minorities with the environment. Dr. Maya Rose Craig, known on social media as Bird Girl, is an environmentalist who opposes Bristol Airport's expansion plans. Maya Rose can't be here today because she has at a book launch event for her new book, We Have a Dream, which tells of the way that Indigenous people around the world who are disproportionately impacted by climate change are often not a part of the climate conversation. Unfortunately, the inquiry has taken the decision to not allow pre-recorded comments to be made by members of the public, but if you want to hear Maya Rose's own voice, we will also be sharing a link with the testimony to her film. I am here to read out the transcript of the film so that it can be heard by the inquiry now. These words are Maya Rose's. Mr. Ware, Mrs. Searson, and Mr. Young, I am appealing to you as the inspectors of the Bristol Airport expansion. My name is Maya Rose. I am a 19-year-old and I am a local environmental activist. I have been involved in the Fridays for Future movement. I have spoken on stage with Greta Thunberg, and I have a local charity called Black to Nature, which is all about engaging people from ethnic minority backgrounds from inner city Bristol with nature and the countryside. And for the last 6 months, we have planted hundreds of trees in the local area, but to both engage people with nature and to start to negate some of our carbon emissions from the local area. The last thing we need now is the airport expansion. It seems desperately backward to be doing that in a period where all we should be doing is combating climate change and other environmental issues. No one in the local area wants it, and all it would do is create more pollution, more traffic, and more noise. It's not just local people who are going to be affected by the potential expansion. I personally have family from the other side of the world in Bangladesh who are currently struggling and suffering because of climate change that's been created by emissions from the West and from places like Bristol. I've been incredibly lucky, and I've traveled to the Arctic with Greenpeace about 6 months ago to see the effects of climate change for myself, and what I saw was truly shocking. It was the ice caps melting, it was wildlife fleeing. I have seen climate change for myself, and I know that I have to do something about it now. You are currently here to make a decision about whether or not this expansion should go ahead, whether or not we should be tossing millions more tons of carbon into the air every year, and all I can say is that you are standing on the edge of a decision. You can either move forward and evolve and create the future that we need to combat climate change, or you can take a step backwards, decades backwards, and create more of a problem than we are dealing with already. Thank you for listening, and I will forward this transcript and the film to the program officer later so that, should you wish, you can see and hear Maya Rose for yourself. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, on Teams then, do we have Chloe Naldret?
Yes, you do.
Welcome.
Okay. Thank you very much. Hello. My name's Chloe Naldret. I'm a Bristol resident, a professional theatre producer and a parent. And I'm here furious, frankly, at the possibility that the democratic rejection of Bristol Airport's expansion plans by North Somerset Council might be ignored and overridden at this costly and outrageous appeal. As the planning application revealed, the expansion of the airport is against the wishes of an overwhelming majority of residents. It was turned down by North Somerset Council after fair debate and is opposed by Bristol City Council. As I understand it, it presents no significant opportunities for meaningful employment to the area, threatens to choke the existing road infrastructure, pave vast swathes of beautiful greenbelt land, diminish the quality of life of residents in the surrounding area, and churn an additional 1 million tonnes of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere every year. Is it now the case that rational planning decisions and fair democratic process can just be challenged again and again by big money until it gets the result that it wants? We are in the throes of a climate and ecological emergency. This has been acknowledged by Bristol City Council, WECA, the British government and the UN with their formal declarations of emergency and in their stated ambitions to reduce carbon emissions. It is barely credible, therefore, that airport expansion is even a matter of debate. Such schemes are utterly inconsistent with what we know about the need to immediately reduce our carbon emissions and the concerns and intentions clearly expressed by local, national and international government. We are already seeing the consequences of having warmed the planet by 1.2 degrees. This summer alone, we've seen floods, droughts, fires, apocalyptic scenes and uncompromising heat. We know that we have to stop our carbon emissions right now to avoid the worst impacts of a warmed world. What we do here on decisions like this matters. My children are 12 and 8. Scientists are predicting that within their natural lifespan, we will see 4 degrees of global warming. How can we, when we think of what the world will be like for them and all the other children alive at this present moment, still be pursuing massive infrastructure projects and continuing to support industries which burn catastrophic amounts of fossil fuel? What will our children think of us when they know that we could have made different choices but decided to sell their futures instead? If human life is to continue in a dignified manner, and let's not forget that the cost of our Western lifestyle is that in many parts of the world life is already undignified, then we need to act now to ensure that our future is cleaner and greener than our past. Deeds and not words are needed, and those deeds need to include some brave, bold decisions by our leaders which may not be popular in the short term. Your duty at this inquiry is to our future, not just to our present. The Ipcc report last month is clear that this is code red for humanity. As a mother, what am I supposed to do when I hear environmental science expressed in such uncompromising terms? How am I to look my children in the eye and promise, as I have always done, to keep them safe? My boys need clean air to breathe, a thriving biodiverse environment in which to live, and leaders who prioritise their well-being 50 years from now over the greedy demands of overseas investors. They do not need more cheap flights to Europe. The increased profits of this airport's $200 billion pension fund owners mean nothing to them. Our children deserve better. Bristol Airport is big enough. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Richard Pryor. If you could turn the microphone on. It's just the main button, I think.
That should be better.
Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. I'm grateful for the opportunity to come here today to try and represent the faith communities, those that have a spirituality, a faith in some kind of deity, a greater being, Mother Nature, people that believe in a being that created this amazing, beautiful world. We clearly have a huge responsibility to look after the planet for future generations and for us now. It is quite clear what impacts our life on life itself, the current trajectory we are on. We hear it, we've been hearing it the last few hours, probably last few weeks. We need to look after the planet for future generations. We need to face up to the impacts, the catastrophic place we're heading in. We didn't listen to scientists in 1990, in 2015. Will we take any notice of the latest Ipcc reports we're just been hearing about? This is just truly petrifying. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an academic in climatology, but it's so abundantly clear we're on the cliff edge. I happen to come here today as a Christian. I'd like to, if you excuse me, to read the following. God of power and mystery, who made the universe out of nothing, everything that exists owes its being to you, and without you there will be neither time nor space, landscape, nor any companion creatures. We thank you for the gift of life on earth, for the ground beneath our feet, and the sky above, for water and air and morning light. Help us to see this world as you do, with the same loving eye. I hope that resonates with some of you. Yeah, that's okay. I personally believe in a creator God, a God who I imagine must be literally weeping and watching us destroy his beautiful creation. The arrogance that we seem happy to make a financial gain from the destruction of this beautiful planet, that we see being destroyed in front of our eyes at an extraordinary pace in a generation. We keep hearing about the ecosystems, extinction of so many creatures, polar ice caps, glaciers melting, desertification, Africa, etc., but in Europe as well. Fires destroying huge swathes, and so forests haven't already been cut down. I recently attended an eco-church service. It's been running for about 10 years and it's been dedicated to ecological themes. This is a prayer from there. God of life, our planet is dying. We are responsible for the destruction of species and ecosystems. Save us for our death-dealing systems that rely on fossil fuels, that strip mine the commons, that convert your natural world into cold, hard cash. Give us wisdom and courage to find new ways of living. Empower our children who are striking for the climate. Shield all who work for a healthy environment. And gift COP26 with robust and workable solutions to mitigate the very worst effects of climate disruption. Oh God, this we pray. I also come here as a parent. I come here for our children. I'm sure most of us here have got children, grandchildren. What sort of world are we heading towards? I happened to see the Daily Mail this week, and an article in there. There's a survey of 10,000 children. 40% of them did not want to have children due to their concerns. We just heard that this afternoon. The article went on to say that the majority of young people are filled with anxiety over climate change. More than 3/4 thought the future was frightening. 60% that they were very or extremely worried about climate change. More than half said they felt afraid, sad, anxious, powerless, helpless, and guilty. And these affected their daily life. Every day they were feeling this. And they also said governments are failing them, betraying future generations, lying about the impacts of actions taken on climate change, and dismissing people's distress about the issues. I do hope this inquiry doesn't do the same. Just the Daily Mirror, the news seems to be getting across. The Daily Mirror today, climate emergency. If we don't act now, this is our future. And amazingly, most of the papers taken up with climate change. It's shockingly ironic that Bristol Airport is owned by the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan. There's a wonderful YouTube piece from children at a local school in the Chew Valley, and they are questioning how teachers can be making money out of the destruction of the planet. We've been hearing about the rising heat, and we hear that heat killed over 100,000 people in 2018 in the European Union, when high temperatures soared. Rising heat is meant to be responsible for 37% of heat-related deaths globally from greenhouse gases. The BBC reported just this week that we've now doubled the amount of days over 50 where there's temperatures over 50 degrees centigrade, where life is hardly sustainable. And that's, that increase is over the last 40 years, since the 1980s. And 100% of this is attributed to the burning of fossil fuels. The World Health Organization says that climate change already has estimated to cause over 150,000 deaths annually. And we're talking about 1 degree above pre-industrial levels at the moment. As we're hearing, we're heading for 2, 3, 4 degrees on this trajectory. You've heard last week testimony from Professor Kevin Anderson, Sam Hunter-Jones, Finlay Asher and others. You've heard the facts they've presented to this inquiry. They're not motivated by money, but they're motivated by truth and what scientists are telling them and telling us about the destiny we're facing. We've heard false and dishonest claims about carbon neutrality by Bristol Airport and the absurdity of ignoring the emissions from aircraft flying to and from Bristol Airport, of cars driving to and from, which is part of the main way they make profits from car parking and turning our green belt into car parks. Dan Norris was recently elected the new Metro Mayor. He stood on one of the pledges he was to fight the airport expansion. He democratically was elected. And he says he's sticking to his commitment to oppose the airport's proposed expansion, saying now is not the time to expand Bristol Airport. As you may know, WECA are meeting next week to debate this very subject, and I gather that 3 out of 5 are against the expansion at that meeting. As well as Metro Mayor, he used to be an MP and was an Environment Minister. So he was democratically elected saying that. We also hear that many others, including from the faith community, who know and understand the science, such as His Holiness Pope Francis, in a TED talk about a year ago, he says, "Science tells us every day with more precision that urgent action is needed. And I'm not dramatizing. This is what science says. If we are to keep the hope of avoiding radical and catastrophic climate change, and for this we must act now. This is a scientific fact," and that's the Pope, and I gather he's spoken again in the last week, and other leaders have. Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg's prayer for the day on Radio 4 this week, where he prayed about our need to think greener ways and minimising carbon emissions. He stated that net zero is among humanity's most urgent goals. And he prayed about inner renewal and rededicating ourselves to establishing a just and compassionate society. A Muslim view, my responsibility to the planet is not just as a campaigner, but as a Muslim. To me, the two are synonymous. Muslim community leaders have been very clear that neglecting to reduce our carbon footprint is neglecting our religious obligation. We were appointed by God as stewards to care and preserve this green and beautiful earth. Honestly, is there anyone in this room, when they look at these issues, can honestly support airport expansion? We will be literally stealing something that is not ours to steal, including life itself. We have to radically reduce our carbon emissions now. With planes flying overhead and all the cars driving through our local roads, it's a local issue, but it's not NIMBYism. It's basically the matter of not on my planet. We can't go ahead with this. I'm a member of Christian Climate Action, and many people I know have made huge sacrifices. People have been arrested, as we know, people have gone to prison, and yet other people are just happy to profit and make financial gain out of destroying this planet, while others are making huge sacrifices. Parallels with the tobacco industry, I think, in the past, where lies were told at the face of, with people potentially dying. Earlier this month, the government published a policy paper, Valuation of Greenhouse Gas Emissions for Policy Appraisal and Evaluation. In this paper, carbon values are used in the form of a cost-benefit analysis to assess whether take into account all the factors such as the impacts of climate change and the environment. We need to meet our 5 yearly carbon budgets. Plainly, Bristol Airport expanding is directly against this and will breach policies where they need to be accountable. So just finally, I want to say, it is quite clear when one takes in the overall evidence that has been submitted in this inquiry, the overall intended increase in flights and thereby the overtly planned increase in climate change gases will conflict with this government's paper, as well as our legally bound commitment to reduce our carbon equivalent gases. It would be extremely embarrassing with our leadership in COP26. Therefore, with all that we've heard in this room, we have to be unequivocal. It's inconceivable that we go ahead with this expansion. And just finally to finish with, just want to read the following. Dear God, you renew the face of the earth and bring newness to our world. Restore the waters, refresh the air, revive the land, breathe new life into your creation, and begin with us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, on Teams, do we have Tanguy Tomes?
Yep. Yeah, I'm here.
Hello.
Yeah, before I start, could I just check that people present in the room have a hard copy of 3 charts? They're distinct but related. It should.
We've not got the... Is that something you've sent in, sir? Or,
Yeah, I believe Mr. Clark or might have them.
Okay, what is
Sorry,
it?
yes, I've got, Tanguy sent them to me to give out.
Okay, what are they?
They're graphs, I'm not sure.
Okay, if you...
Thank you.
Cool. Great, thanks.
Okay. Okay, we've got those. Are you sharing your screen as well? Is this I presume that's on purpose.
Yeah, that is on purpose. Hope that's okay.
Okay.
I'm happy. I can see that someone else has just taken control, but I'm happy to just say next if that's easier.
I don't know are you not controlling it yourself? Or?
Probably. It looks like someone else just took control, but I can try and take it back. So let's take it back. Cool. So great. Thank you for having me. My name is Tongi. I'm 26. I'm an environmental professional. And with this presentation, I'll be kind of trying to speak to and explain some of the charts that you've just received in front of you. And on those charts, I'm trying to relay the entirety of the climate impact of an expanded Bristol Airport. And I know that's something that's probably come up a lot of times, but I'm trying to contextualize it visually, as in my experience as a climate policy analyst for governments across the world, numbers on a page often don't quite communicate things as well as a colorful chart. So that's what I'll be aiming to do. So first of all, here's the chart. The annotations don't matter too much, so don't worry if they're hard to read. I'll walk us through it. Essentially, on the horizontal axis, we have time in years, and then on the vertical, we have carbon emissions going from 0 all the way up to 7 million tons per year. The yellow trace you can see is historic data for North Somerset up to and including 2017. So that includes the impact of housing, businesses, cars, everything deemed to be within the scope of influence of the local authority. And in February 2019, with a declaration of the climate emergency, the council declared that they would be net zero by 2030, and that will require a lot of hard work and a lot of brave decisions by local businesses, local families, local councillors. But it's the hard work and the dedication like that that we need to avoid the worst impacts of climate breakdown. Now, by convention, these accounts don't really include aviation emissions, even though the airport is well within the authority borders. So, this blue trace is historic data based on fuel combusted in actual flights that actually left Bristol Airport. So far, I'm just scene setting. And as we all know, the airport has permission to continue growing up to a capacity of 10 million passengers per year. And this trace assumes that to get there, there's just a continuation of historic passenger growth rates. That's all there is. Bristol Airport, of course, has plans to grow beyond that figure. And in February 2020, those plans were roundly rejected by the local community and the local authority. But for today, let's entertain those plans. So if it goes up to 12 million passengers, again, assuming there's a historic passenger growth rate continuing, then we see a bit of a pattern emerging, that the growth in flights from the airport is cancelling out all the efforts of all the residents and elected representatives in North Somerset. Overall emissions are not declining well into this decade. It's a fairly straightforward conclusion, but despite that, the airport is very public about its plans to continue expanding towards 20 million passengers a year by the 2040s. So again, just for entertainment, let's see what that does for our trace. Now, of course, that doesn't look good. But of course, also the carbon dioxide from fuel combustion is only part of the story. Non-CO2 impacts, including from contrails and water vapor high up in the atmosphere, almost double the heating impact. We're now kind of considering a hypothetical but pretty outrageous position where 10 years after the local authority has reached net zero, flights from an expanded Bristol Airport are contributing 4 times as much to the climate impact as the whole local authority was a generation prior. And I wish I could end it there, but the fuel wouldn't magic itself into tanks. It needs extracting, refining, transporting, pumping, and all of that has an impact, referred to in carbon accounting as well-to-tank emissions. And these are represented by the teal wedge. On top of that, more flights means more aircraft, all of which need to be manufactured. Emissions from that process represent this small, but really not insignificant wedge. Finally, more flights and more aircraft means more operations of the footprint with a larger footprint. And I wish I could stop there, but there's another accounting convention which I really feel like I need to explain in this context, and that's to do with return flights. So a standard carbon accounting convention means that airports only account for emissions from outgoing flights. Bristol to Frankfurt is accounted for by Bristol, and the return from Frankfurt to Bristol is accounted for by Frankfurt. It makes sense in a kind of steady state network where you've got flights going between A to B to C and back to A. You wouldn't want all the airports accounting for all the emissions, as it would be double counting and inaccurate. But in the case of expansion, neither the outgoing nor the return flight would have space to approach, land, take off, or taxi if the airport hadn't expanded. So the emissions which hinge on the decision in question today can't abide by that convention. They have to include the emissions from return flights. So let's add them on. So there we are. To summarize, Bristol Airport's vision for expansion leads to almost 7 million tons of emissions annually by 2040. But something I really want to emphasize is that it doesn't have to be this way. When North Somerset Council made the decision to reject any additional expansion of permitted capacity at Bristol Airport, they chose a different path. They chose to listen to the overwhelming majority of people, local to North Somerset, but also from across the world who objected to the application. And here's the alternative. The airport doesn't disappear. It continues with it to provide its employment and transport links for the local community, but with much lower emissions. The Ipcc recently declared Code Red for humanity, and this red wedge is facing us head on. It is absolutely vital that we start looking ahead and start making the right decisions. If this rejection were to be overturned and emissions sent into the sky, we can't go back. An additional 4.5 million tons per year by 2040. Even by the mid-20s, we're talking about additional emissions on the scale of the entire local authority today, which is bigger than dozens of entire nations. really trying to communicate the scale of emissions is often quite difficult because often it's quite big numbers. I found that in my work. But let me just say that on a personal level, the thought of this decision going that way is really, really, really scary. But I will give another couple goes at presenting it. And in the UK, one way we like to try and present impacts is in terms of finances. So let's give that a go. So this is a table, ooh, wrong slide. Oh well. Using the updated UK government guidance and using the NEF analysis of the benefits, you know, even the financial terms of impact versus emissions, the costed emissions, really don't stack up. People have put incredibly powerful moral, spiritual, cultural cases as to why the rejection should be upheld. But even in financial terms, the total economic benefit of expansion is 110 million. But if we correct the climate impact of expansion and apply the most recent values of greenhouse gas emissions for public appraisal, then the monetized emissions come in at £250 million per year, which is a far, far higher factor. Now, one thing that aviation sector, from my experience, is very keen to revert to and rely on is offsets. So again, one last time, since I, like you, like entertainment, let's entertain this notion. The notion being that these emissions could be offset, and then we can just stop worrying about them. Now, if we wanted to offset the additional emissions from an expanded Bristol Airport, if we said, yes, go ahead, we were wrong, you can expand, the net and net zero will save us and we can plant some trees, you would have to reforest an area the size of North Somerset every 4 months, 3 times a year, and then look after them and ensure that they never burn down, they're never chopped down. Now, you don't need to work in landscape restoration to be able to tell that this is unfeasible. But it just so happens that my work now is in landscape restoration, and I am happy to confirm that this isn't possible. It's not possible today, and it won't be possible tomorrow. And on this basis, I urge you to uphold North Somerset's decision to reject this planning application. Genuinely, the world will thank you for it.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. All right. And we're running a little bit behind. I was going to continue on if possible. Yeah. Okay. All right. So in the room we have James Ryle.
Thank you. I hope you've received a copy of a map that I asked the programme officer to circulate before I spoke.
I've just, yeah,
That's the
just
one.
had
Perfect.
that passed to me. Thank you.
Thank you. So, thank you for the opportunity to address the inquiry today. My name's James Ryle. I'm a father. I live in South Bristol and have worked in sustainability for over 20 years. Firstly, in the interest of transparency, I'd like to make it clear I have no employment, commercial or other financial interests in Bristol Airport Limited. There are 2 points that I'd like to draw to the inspector's attention. The first, you won't be surprised to hear, relates to the climate emergency. As you've heard, the world has only a very limited remaining carbon budget if we're to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Beyond that, the impacts are unthinkable. Every tonne of CO2 matters. Under these circumstances, it seems sensible, not to mention fair, to spend this carbon budget where it's most socially useful, for example, on education, healthcare, and tackling poverty. Where we're currently locked into other essential uses of carbon, for instance, burning gas to heat our homes, we need to transition rapidly to zero carbon alternatives. The same might be said of aviation. But in this case, as you will have heard, there are fewer technological solutions in the pipeline. And as the pandemic has amply illustrated, not all flying is essential. There are 2 direct implications for the appeal proposal in my view. Firstly, we can afford no net expansion in airport capacity. The government's climate change advisors, the Climate Change Committee, have said as much, even though they allow for some growth in demand for flights. This means, quite simply, that if one airport wants to take another 2 or 3 million passengers a year, another should agree to take 2 or 3 million less. Secondly, to maintain its license to operate, even at current levels, aviation as a whole, in my view, should remove carbon from the atmosphere equivalent to all the warming gases it continues to pump in. Every year, starting now. Not waiting until 2050 or even 2030, and without relying on cheap carbon offsets as it does now, investing instead in carbon removal with permanent geological storage. Nothing I have seen suggests this proposal comes close to complying with either of these conditions. On the subject of carbon offsets, I'd like to say something about the dangerous illusion, as I see it, of a net zero airport. This is the concept the airport relies on to address concerns about its climate impact. So I think it's worth taking a closer look. In its draft Carbon and Climate Change Action Plan submitted to the inquiry, but not so far published elsewhere, the airport sets itself a target of becoming carbon net zero in all its operations and activities by 2030. Now, as others have noted, and the action plan itself acknowledges, this target excludes the majority, at least 70% of its overall carbon footprint. That's the carbon footprint due to the actual aeroplanes flying in and out of the airport, as well as surface access by its millions of passengers every year. I'll come back to that bit. Now, to reach that narrowly defined 2030 target, as well as reducing some emissions, the airport plans to offset any residual emissions through carbon removals. This it defines as the process of capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and locking it away for decades, centuries, or longer. Conveniently, this definition allows forestry projects to be included in its plans for offsetting future operational emissions. Fair enough, you might think, as trees absorb carbon dioxide, but as we've seen from recent forest fires in the US, Canada, and Russia, that process can be driven quite dramatically into reverse as a result of extreme hot weather induced by climate change. As reported just last month, as a result of some of these forest fires, companies like Microsoft and BP, which have made net zero commitments not dissimilar to those of Bristol Airport, have seen their carbon offsets quite literally go up in smoke. Even if such forest survives, serious doubts are now emerging over the methodologies used to calculate the amounts of CO2 they can absorb for the purposes of selling carbon credits into the offset market. So what of alternative geological forms of carbon removal which the airport references in its plan? These are like direct air capture, which involves sucking CO2 out of the air with giant fans and injecting it into rock hundreds of meters below the ground. Not surprisingly, these technologies are still in their infancy. The world's largest direct air capture facility was opened recently in Iceland at a cost of around £100 million and is due to capture 4,000 tons of CO2 from the air every year. It sounds impressive, but just for comparison, Bristol Airport would need its own direct air capture plant nearly 1.5 times this size just to absorb its current annual operational, that is Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions of around 5,700 tons of CO2. Again, not including flights. So, the bigger issue, of course, is the emissions from flights. On this, the airport makes the bold claim that by 2050, it will become net zero as a whole, including aviation and surface access emissions. The airport itself estimates this to be around 70% of its overall footprint. But as we've just heard, if all emissions associated with the expansion are included, this will be a much greater share than that. And how will it reach this wider net zero target? Mainly, it would seem, by influencing its supply chain, including the airlines themselves, supporting research into sustainable flights, and yes, more offsetting. As others have noted, not only is 2050 for any net zero target far too late, but this reliance on unproven and even non-existent technologies is, in my view, not just downright dangerous, but deeply deceitful. My second point relates to public legitimacy. One of my early assignments, if you'll forgive the indulgence, as a junior environmental consultant before the turn of the millennium, now that does age me, was to review hundreds of written responses to a government consultation on its very first sustainable development strategy. Among other things, this taught me that paying lip service to the views of people affected by policy and planning decisions is no substitute for meaningful engagement. In the years since, it's become ever clearer to me through my work that genuine public involvement will be key to the success of the zero carbon transition that is so desperately needed. This is the case as much in shaping government policy, for example through the recent Climate Assembly, as it is for shifting individual behaviour towards lower carbon choices like more plant-based diets, walking and cycling instead of driving, and so on. And it applies equally to the planning process, which, as we know, can have deep and long-lasting impacts on people's lives, as well as on the natural and built environment. And here, it's worth recalling the 11,500 responses to the original planning application, of which nearly 80% objected to the proposed expansion of Bristol Airport. While naturally high amongst communities most closely affected by the airport, a substantial portion of this opposition came from the wider West of England region and from across the southwest. The map that's been kindly circulated by the programme officer shows the distribution of this opposition based on a postcode plot of the representations made to the original application. Just as significantly, in my view, most if not all parish councils which expressed the view, whether from North Somerset or further afield, also opposed the proposal. And this was before the elected members of North Somerset Council rejected the application in February last year by 18 votes to 7. Finally, just this week, we hear that the support for the airport's plans is looking even thinner on the ground, with the West of England Combined Authority preparing to formally oppose expansion. Now, none of this is to argue that any development should be permitted with only majority support, or indeed solely with the approval of the planning authority or the backing of one mayor or another. The right to appeal is an important recourse for either side in a planning decision. I know this from a 4-year stint working on wind and solar farm developments for a UK renewable energy company. But what I also learned from that experience was that where a proposal fails to attract support in the very constituencies it purports to benefit, its legitimacy is open to question at best. Even more so when in reality the bulk of the benefit of that development accrues to a distant, unaccountable ownership structure and a small, relatively wealthy customer base. In other words, in the case of an airport proposal, that 15% of the population, which takes 70% of the flights in the UK, that you have already heard about. So, to conclude, at a time when we need everyone on board with urgent action to avert climate catastrophe, we should listen when people and their democratically elected representatives are trying to do the right thing. Allowing Bristol Airport to expand would be bad for the climate. There can be no dispute, with all the terrible consequences set out so eloquently in the other submissions you've heard today and from previous expert witnesses. Granting this appeal in the face of such opposition, and as the terrifying impacts of climate breakdown finally break through to our front pages, the damage, I believe, would not be limited to the extra emissions. I believe it would also fatally undermine public faith in the planning system and in government policy more widely to protect us from the worst effects of global heating. If that happens, we are all lost. For these reasons, For these reasons, I urge you to be bold, listen to the science, be good ancestors, and so dismiss this appeal. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, on Teams, do we have a Rafaela Rash with us, please?
Hi there.
Hello. Thank you.
Hello, you can see me.
Yes.
Firstly, just so much gratitude to be able to be here and be heard. I strongly oppose the planning request to expand Bristol Airport from 10 to 12 million passengers per year. I want to begin by describing what we've learned from Earth system science, that the Earth system, with its biosphere, hydrosphere, atmosphere, geosphere, effectively is a closed system. And what that means in real terms is there is a fixed amount of matter within that system. There is a limited amount of mineral resources that we have available to us. And any outputs that we put into that system, anything that we change, has effects at other parts of the system. We can't escape that. That's the Earth system that we have the amazing gift of being able to inhabit alongside all the other life forms. And one thing that's absolutely essential within that Earth system for it to be able to stay at equilibrium and continue sustaining life is that the feedback loops are intact. So, for example, if you look at the system of the human body, when the temperature goes too high within the human body, there are absolutely essential negative feedback loops which allow the body to start sweating, the hairs to stand up, and the body can cool itself down. Without that, the body would overheat and die. And similarly, this Earth system that we are part of relies on the negative feedback loops in order to stay at equilibrium and be able to continue sustaining life. Now, this capacity for the system, the capacity of the Earth system to respond to this feedback is absolutely critical. It's a life and death question. And for that feedback loop to be intact, there has to be a response to the feedback. Now, whether you choose to acknowledge the weather that we've been experiencing in the world, or whether you look at the science, and I'm so grateful for the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, the Ipcc report. It's so clear. The feedback is so clear. I'm just reading some of the statements that came through, that human-induced climate change is already affecting many weather and climate extremes in every region across the globe. The evidence of observed changes in extremes such as heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts, and tropical cyclones, and in particular, their attribution to human influence has strengthened since the 5th assessment report. Global warming of 1.5 and 2 degrees C will be exceeded during the 21st century unless deep reductions in CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions occur. And then to add to that, under scenarios with increasing CO2 emissions, ocean and land carbon sinks are projected to be less effective at slowing carbon dioxide accumulation in the atmosphere. With every additional increment of global warming, changes in extremes continue to become larger, including hot extremes, marine heat waves, heavy precipitation, droughts, and tropical cyclones. The feedback is absolutely clear. The feedback is there. And as part of this Earth system, we are part of that feedback loop. Are we responding to that feedback or not? And if we are not responding to that feedback, what is getting in the way? It's not a matter of choice or preference. The natural laws that are part of this incredible Earth system are such that if feedback is not responded to, the system cannot maintain equilibrium, it cannot retain balance, and it falls apart. So when I sit with this question of when I'm feeling into the fact that the feedback is so clear, whether you look at the weather or whether you look at the science, and we're still asking ourselves this question, should Bristol Airport expand? Should it expand from 10 to 12 million passengers a year? I feel there's another really important question below that, which is, what is driving our choices? What are our values? What compass are we using to make our choices? What's driving us? What are our priorities? Now, I didn't want to make any assumptions about this, so I had a look at what Bristol Airport have to say on this, and Dave Lees, the Chief Executive Officer, mentions priorities such as meeting demand for air travel, more routes, destinations and jobs, and ensuring that we continue to connect our region to the world, providing a gateway for business, investment and tourists. Now, when I sit with that, and I invite us to do the same, to feel into that, what's driving that? When I read that, I see speed, ease of travel, making more of the globe accessible faster, because we could travel to other airports or we could take the train, economic growth, profit. Now, if that's what's driving our choices, we have to be aware that that comes at a cost, a huge cost, because within this Earth system, if we prioritize one variable, such as profit or economic growth or speed and ease of travel, if that's the most important thing for us, if that's what we're prioritizing over others, if those variables are more highly prioritized over the others, the system can't regulate. It can't stay in balance because there's not an overall evenness across the different variables. If any one is prioritized higher than the others, the system goes into overshoot and collapses. That's not a matter of choice or opinion. That's what we know. And we also know that blocking feedback is ultimately, for a system such as the system we live within, is suicidal, because if the system can't regulate because the feedback's not being responded to, it can't stay at equilibrium. So we've heard a lot of evidence, there's a lot of information there, and as beings that are part of this Earth system, we also have the capacity to feel and know within our hearts what we are believing in any given moment. And I see this inner work as absolutely vital, because if my priorities are speed, the pace at which I can get around the globe, more of the globe accessible to me in a shorter period of time, economic growth or profit, if that's what's driving our choices, we are going to make a different choice, which ultimately comes at a cost. The Ipcc report has shown us that there is no wriggle room. We don't have the luxury of taking a gamble here. And I really urge us to take some time and just look within, because if we are being driven by those values, the values that are very popular since the Industrial Revolution, of speed, profit, quantity over quality, if that's what's driving us, we will make a different choice here. And it takes courage and integrity and I just see it as our responsibility to be very aware what's driving our choices. If we are choosing not to respond to the feedback that we're seeing in the science and in the weather conditions at the moment, and if we are choosing not to respond to that, what is getting in the way? What are we believing? What is guiding our choices at the moment? I hope that's clear. I'm feeling a bit nervous and it's hard to kind of get my point across. I wanted to close with some words from Joanna Macy, which speak to this, and then one more quote. So from Joanna Macy: uncertainty, when accepted, sheds a bright light on the power of intention. This is what you can count on, not the outcome, but the motivation you bring, the vision you hold, the compass setting you choose to follow. That to me is really important work, that we become aware of which values are we pursuing, which values are we holding highly. And to close, I wanted just to say, and perhaps to ask yourself as well how you feel on this matter. Personally, I stand for what I stand on. Do you? And if not, why not? It's our life support system. So if not, what is getting in the way of that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. I've got quite a few more to get through this afternoon. There's quite a few people in the back of the room here. There's also quite a few that have joined us on Teams. We are going to try and get through you all today. If anyone has any pressing time commitments, if you can let, there's a hand up at the back there, that if you can let the programme officer know, but and we'll try and work around that. I think at this stage, we've heard a lot of passionate and clear and articulate statements today. If we can avoid being overly repetitive of those and quoting things that we may have already had a lot of quotes from this morning, the Ipcc report, just to help things speed along a little bit, but we do want to hear from you all today, okay. Okay. Programme officer's indicating to me. Okay, can we have Joe Cook up now then, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Hello. I've got to pick up my daughter from nursery, so I appreciate you seeing me next. I'm aware this is obviously overrun, so thank you so much for your time. Would everyone like to just have a quick stretch, just to kind of get a bit of energy, because I'm aware that people are probably exhausted. I mean, I feel tired sitting here, and I've been here 45 minutes. So I am a local resident. I live in Blagdon. I am the mother of a 3-year-old daughter, and I'm the managing director and co-founder of a UK-registered charity called Temwa that works in Malawi. I was born at the BRI, raised in Wraxall, close to Bristol Airport. I spent most of my life living in Bristol. I'm as local as they come, and I can assure you the local community I know does not want the airport to expand. As a mother, I am desperately worried about the future of my child. She has a very safe, happy, loving home environment. There's a lot of stability there. However, what will the world be like in 20, 30 years' time? Will there be stability? I urge you to watch every David Attenborough documentary. His latest one, Breaking Boundaries 2021, he says, are we at risk of destabilizing the whole planet? Recent discoveries made by scientists studying the way in which our planet works are surely of the greatest importance for us all. Their insights are deeply troubling. Nonetheless, they also give us hope because they show us how we can fix things. It's on Netflix, please watch it. I can assure you how we fix things is by reducing CO2 emissions, not expanding the airport. I am, however, mainly here to speak on behalf of the Global South, who don't have a voice the majority of the time, and they are dealing with the brunt of the crisis now, and it is a crisis. In 2019, Cyclone Ida hit Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe. It had devastating consequences. Beira, one of the largest cities in Mozambique, ironically twinned with Bristol, was destroyed by 90%. The port, hospitals, government buildings, universities, schools, completely destroyed. An inland lake in Mozambique, the size of Luxembourg, formed due to flooding, destroying towns and villages, washing away crops, displacing thousands of people, and killing hundreds of people. David Simango, Mayor of Beira, says, every day I see how the climate is changing. The sea is rising. The waves are stronger and bigger. I watch how the temperature changes. It's not like it was before. This is the effect of climate change. It's been happening for years and it's getting worse. In the community, my organisation serves in Malawi. Heavy rains have destroyed crops in the dry season this year. This is unprecedented. It does not rain in the dry season. The experts are putting this down to climate change. Now, I know families whose crops have been destroyed. They've lost their income, their food source, and when this happens, they go down to eating one small meal a day. Sometimes one small meal every other day. People are going hungry and they are starving. Does anyone in this room know a family that does not have any food? There are no food banks and no social services. This year, again in Malawi, their second largest lake has dried up. Scientists have attributed this to climate change. I will link all of this. I will forget the Ipcc quotes. You've got them. This is a quote from a survivor of a cyclone in Myanmar. I'm going to warn you, it's upsetting. Mint Ai and her husband and their two daughters, aged 3 and 6, took their boat to a nearby island to buy wood. The family lived selling timber. The family planned to sleep in the boat. They saw nothing unusual in the wind, which gathered steadily throughout the afternoon, but by 9 p.m. it reached a force so frightening they abandoned the boat for shore and went into a house. Some 25 others were already carrying there. As the cyclone approached, it drove massive waves up the vast tidal rivers that drain from the Ayeyarwady Delta into the Indian Ocean. The floodwaters surged over the island where Mint Ai's family were marooned, tearing the house from its stilt legs and driving its collapsed structure into a nearby haystack. She says, I couldn't see anything. All I know is that people were grabbing at the haystack and trying to hold on to each other as the water pulled us. My husband and I held hands, and we each held one of the children. Cast into the water, she lost her husband's hand forever. Minutes later, she says the realization crept over her that the life was slipping away from her 3-year-old daughter, who was still in her grasp. Stricken by grief, she gave herself up to the current, preferring to hold the tiny body of her daughter than to save herself. Although that I knew my daughter was dead, I told myself I would never let her go. The wind and water was too much for her, and she became limp as a piece of cloth. She washed up on another island, bits of wood were piling on top of her, and she says, I was stuck beneath them. I struggled to get out, and I realized I'd let go of my child. This is an individual account, but millions of people have to deal with floods and droughts, and the floods and droughts are increasing because of climate change. It's a scientific fact that cannot be denied. Bristol Airport wants to expand, dramatically expanding CO2 emissions and climate change. This is pure greed. The airport wants to make money, and it's morally corrupt. I find this greed and selfishness unbearable. The vast number of scientists who have studied the climate have predicted extreme weather events, droughts, floods, wildfires, the Arctic ice melting at an unprecedented rate. It's happening quicker than predicted, reference Ipcc report. We're in the midst of a crisis, undoubtedly the biggest crisis humanity has ever faced. We should all be doing everything in our power to reverse the impacts of climate change, to reduce CO2 emissions, but yet businesses want to go ahead and expand airports. It is madness, it's insanity, it's not logical, and it's definitely not moral. The impact of the pandemic has shown us how we can travel less, we can do business online using Teams and Zoom. People are flying less. I've flown from Bristol Airport many times. I will never fly from Bristol Airport ever again. I know many people like me who are reducing and eradicating air travel. I know a previous speaker likened the ludicrous airport expansion to the emperor's new clothes. However, it's more sinister than that. In The Emperor's New Clothes, a small child was the only person to speak up and say the emperor was naked. Everyone else pretended he was in fine clothes. This time, children are speaking up, and there is a child waiting to speak to us, and they are screaming at the adults in the room to halt destructive business practice, causing climate chaos, severely jeopardizing their future, but the adults are ignoring them. A report came out 2 days ago, 14th of September. One of the lead researchers in this report, Caroline Hickman from Bath University, it was the largest study of eco-anxiety and youth. This global survey found that the large majority of 16 to 25-year-olds worry a huge amount about their future. They feel failed by the government and the adults. 4 out of 10 young people fear having children due to the climate crisis. This is the largest research ever done on youth dealing with the climate crisis. This summer, I spoke to my 9-year-old nephew for the first time about climate change. He knew more about climate change than many adults. He knew we have a few years left to make the changes needed to tackle this crisis. I had to keep myself composed and fight back tears, as I am desperately worried we will fail our children. The political and business leaders won't take action needed to tackle the climate crisis. I want all of us to look the next generation in the eye and tell them we did everything possible to tackle climate change. Gandhi said, "Be the change you want to see in the world." Our UK Board of Trustees in Tenway is incredibly professional. We have the HR Director for Triodos Bank. We have consultants on fundraising and international development. The second longest serving board member is Rich Potter, the CTO for Microsoft. I asked him for a quote because I told him I was coming to speak, and he said, "No comment." And then he said, "The airport is one of my clients." Think about this. People cannot comment because of their business connections. I'll finish with a 3-word David Attenborough quote. He says, "Tackling climate change is a colossal but winnable fight." I urge everyone listening, everyone in the room, talk to your friends and family about this. Make the right decision. I'll say it again. Colossal but winnable fight, and make the right decision. Thank you very much for hearing me.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, I haven't had to say this before, but can you please not applaud, not make any noise whilst the speakers are speaking or afterwards? It's very distracting for us. We are trying to focus, all of us, at the end of a long day, so please, let's do it quietly. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next then, we've got George Ferguson with us virtually.
Good afternoon.
Hello.
Thank you very much for allowing me to give evidence. I'm George Ferguson, CB. I was the first elected mayor of Bristol, serving from 2012 to 16. I won't read out all my qualifications, but I will be giving evidence largely from the point of view of being a businessman in Bristol over the past 50 years. However, I was an elected member of Bristol City Council from 1973 to 1979, when I briefly served on the airport committee when it was in public ownership. I was subsequently removed from the committee for proposing that Bristol Airport be moved from Lulsgate to Filton or Sevenside, which was possible then because it wasn't so inhabited, because of its unsustainable location. It then had well under 500,000 passengers a year flying from Bristol Airport, since when it was privatised and has grown into the principal regional airport that it is today. Bristol's been my airport of choice for international travel for some 50 years, and I've always found it one of the better airports to use, apart from its lack of sustainable transport connections, making it largely car dependent. As an international conference speaker, I confess to having been a relatively frequent flyer until COVID hit. Since when, I've lost the desire to travel by air, as have many people, have spoken at many international and domestic conferences and seminars by team and Zoom and other means, and had in any case been significantly reducing European and domestic air travel in favour of train. I never fly to Europe, and I didn't before COVID, if I could possibly avoid it, and went by train. I'm concerned that the inquiry may have been unintentionally misled, with little or any real evidence that the business community is generally in favour of expansion. I find the opposite to be true, starting with the half dozen or so businesses that I'm involved with as a director and shareholder. Each one of their management and board see no good reason for the expansion of Bristol Airport. No good reason. This is not an emotional climate judgment, which I absolutely I relate to, but the important thing is that there's no good business reason. However, I wish to conduct a more widespread survey, albeit a random one, and contacted some 75 local businesses on my email contact list, asking them to state yes or no to expansion. This was only sent out on the 9th of September, 1 week ago today. I have today received responses from about half those sent. No to expansion, I think the total is 27. I could read them all out, but I will just take one or two. They vary from property companies, hairdresser salons, entertainment companies. Just take a few quotes. I never seem to have any issues booking what I need. Even as an international touring company, we've never found there to be a limit to flights. Almost all of my international tour flights have originated from Bristol in the last 14 years. We and many others in our industry are also planning to reduce the number of flights we take anyhow. The airport expansion is not necessary for us. I've been given permission to name nearly all these companies, and they're on my transcript. CJ Property Limited, there are currently plenty of destination routes and ample departures and arrivals. Click Limited, about the right size to accommodate both businesses and domestic customers. Any further expansion will have an impact on our local infrastructure and environment. Fighting Films Limited, my company sends its production team all around the world, flying from Bristol Airport with KLM via Amsterdam. The service is good and the airport does not need expanding. Forward Space, I think the emphasis should be on creating better train links to a central UK airport hub. I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's what he says, rather than creating a network of ever-growing regional hubs. PR company, we avoid flying for work at all costs and have a slow travel policy. And just, it goes on and on like that. Kensington Arms, Redland, long haul will surely always mean a trip to a larger airport designed for the purpose. Chartered accountants, I'm consciously trying to reduce the mile I travel for business each year, as I'm sure many other people in businesses are. Primary VFX, any expansion now will not only be an environmental travesty, but also a terrible investment. And that's a very canny business person. Pitch limited air travel is far too cheap, and this is simply because we're not paying the real price for environmental damage and use of finite resources. Salt and Malt Limited, the airport is currently ample for my needs, which are reducing rather than increasing these days. Interesting, that person actually is advertised at Bristol Airport, so it's not. Umberslade, a major property company in Bristol, Umberslade does not want or need expansion. It goes on and on like that. Yes to expansion, 3 companies. So that actually is 90% no, 10% yes. Now make some allowance for the fact that people might think that I wanted the answer no, but I can tell you that they were very definite no's. If you make allowance for that, I would estimate that at least 3/4 of business in the Bristol region is against expansion of the airport. The above list doesn't include any one of the 6 Bristol catering and hospitality companies that I'm a director of, all of which are adamantly opposed to the expansion. In addition to this email survey, I talked with owner-directors of several of Bristol's leading companies last night at a large gathering at the SS Great Britain, the first of its kind for 18 months, which was coincidentally useful, and was impressed by the vast majority being against the expansion, some of whom had changed their minds over the past 18 months and felt that both from a practical user and ethical point of view that expansion was unnecessary and now unjustified. And what is interesting is that Business West has not asked that question of them over that whole period, over the whole 18 months pandemic period. This gathering, the Bristol Initiative, was hosted by Business West and was preceded by talks by the Chief Executive, Chair and new President, all referring to climate action and not going back to the old normal, saying that that's not an option post-pandemic, but with no single mention of air travel or the airport. The head of climate strategy gave an excellent talk on Business West's environmental and sustainable transport initiatives, and finishing with a plea to walk the walk. In conversation with her and others afterwards, there is a clear equivocation and some outright opposition within the organisation itself as to the stance that Business West has taken over the airport at this inquiry. What is very clear is that their evidence regarding business support has not been tested in recent times, and there is considerable embarrassment at this stance within the organisation and its membership. Interestingly, I've just been sent the Southwest Infrastructure Partnership Manifesto for Bristol by its chairman, who I met last night, our journey to net zero. This is the infrastructure partnership, all the major infrastructure businesses within this region. The only mention of the airport in a long document is a passing one at the end, referring to the strategic importance of the Port of Bristol and Bristol Airport and supporting them to achieve net zero. No, there's no mention of expansion or not. Not only has the way we do business changed, but attitudes have changed amongst business leaders who are more aware than ever of the need for behaviour change, of which flying less is at the top of the list. It was remarkable last night talking to people about their changes in attitude, hard-nosed business people. Based on all this direct evidence, it's clear that business users of Bristol Airport are generally satisfied with it and see no need for expansion. And ironically, with many preferring it when it was smaller and more user-friendly, prior to, and this is a quote from somebody, becoming the bucket and spade and hens and stag airport as been described. Thank you very much for enabling me to give this evidence.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Next then, also via Teams, is Charlotte Buxton. Ms. Ferguson, if you could turn your camera off now, please. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi, sorry, I've also got to go and look after children in a minute. So I'm making this statement on behalf of Chew Valley Plants Trees, and it's a voluntary organisation formed about a year ago with a single aim of doubling tree cover in the Chew Valley by 2030. We're fuelled by a passion for the value of trees to capture carbon and to support wildlife. The Chew Valley has only 7% tree cover at present. The UK average is 13% and the European average is 32%. So we're catching up with national averages, and we've got a huge challenge ahead of us to pursue our goal. In 2020, we planted our first 1,000 oaks across the Chew Valley in a number of locations. We're taking care in our decision making, aiming to plant the right tree in the right place for the right reason. To double the tree cover of the Chew Valley, we need to plant between 1,000 to 2,000 hectares of woodland, which is around 250 acres a year. It is our belief that the seriousness of the present climate and nature emergency demands a radical reduction in carbon emissions, at the very least a pause in any growth or development that increases carbon emissions. Before the COVID pandemic, this might have felt like an impossible dream. But during the various lockdowns, the Chew Valley has benefited from the reduction in noise pollution, from improved air quality, and from being able to walk and cycle on roads not dominated by airport traffic. As a result of this, many of us have decided to fly less in the future. That said, we're not asking for an end to air travel, but rather for the airport to only seek expansion if and when the developments in technology have enabled aviation to be truly net zero in every part of its operation, without the use of offsetting. Increased planes over the next decade will inevitably mean increased carbon is burnt. Technological solutions for zero carbon flight, if they can be made commercially viable, will not be available in this key decade when we are seeking to grow our tree cover to capture existing carbon. An expansion of the airport would effectively wipe out any impact we might be having by planting these trees. This is heartbreaking and also unacceptable at a time where we all need to pull together to survive the impacts of our heating planet. We therefore ask that you refuse this appeal so that the expansion of Bristol Airport cannot go ahead at this point in time. There is no reason why the airport should not apply again if and when the technology is in place to fly commercially without using fossil fuels in any part of the operation, including Scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions. To do so would give us a fighting chance of leaving behind us a better world for our children and a legacy of health and well-being in our beautiful valley, which so many people enjoy for leisure and tourism, as a bolt hole away from city life. That's me done.
Thank you very much. If you haven't already sent your transcript in, please can you do so? Okay.
Yes.
Ms. Buxton, just one thing. You were very clear all the way through. I heard every word except right at the beginning. I didn't catch the name of the organisation. Chew Valley.
Plants, trees.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next then, virtually, Jeremy Doyle, please.
Hello, yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak at the inquiry. And I've cut down what I'm going to say based on what other people have been saying. So I hope it will be quite fast.
Thank you, I appreciate
I'm speaking
that.
in a personal capacity. Okay. I'm speaking in a personal capacity. I'm a resident of the Netherlands and a UK citizen. I'm a father, an engineer and an environmental scientist, and I've lived and worked in Bath near Bristol Airport for the previous 20 years. So I know the area very well. I've also studied and worked for over 20 years on the subject of preventing climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I've got 4 points, but before I mention them, I'd like to say that I have 2 teenage children myself, and we've heard a lot about children so far. I'd like to reiterate this really quite crucial point, I think. they are very aware of the situation that we face in terms of climate change. They learn about it in school, and we heard earlier from an educator about the dissonance between what some of the leaders in society are saying and what they're actually doing. So I find this very sad. I find it really quite tragic that we're so out of touch with consistency on this subject. That 75% of people that we've heard are frightened of climate change around the world in the most recent large survey of 10 countries, including the UK. I think this is a super important point that we should all be very, very aware of and respond to. So my 4 points. The first one, expanding Bristol Airport sets a very grave signal for how the UK intends to address climate change. It, first of all, makes huge assumptions that we can offset emissions of growth. We've heard a lot about offsets, but again, this is super important. And just to mention a couple of points on that, Shell's offset plans require 12 million hectares of trees by 2030. Shell alone. A recent analysis shows the offsets from net zero plans right now is impossible arithmetic. I've sent you my transcript and the references are in there. The PR departments of airlines and airports are depending on you and on us not understanding these facts. It's very important for us not to listen to the rhetoric, but to look at the actual analysis that's been done, not too much about the PR messages. The second point, it assumes unfeasible progress on low carbon aviation. Historical trends have shown the opposite. So since the Kyoto Protocol, global emissions have risen by 41%. That's since 2005. Of course, the Kyoto Protocol was planning to reduce global emissions. In the same period, Bristol Airport passengers rose from 1 to 9 million passengers, an increase of 900%. Current plans increase this further. And meanwhile, sustainable aviation fuel, which BA and BP are advertising right now in time for the Glasgow COP, sits at 0.01% of aviation fuel supply. Doubling that every year, every single year on an exponential growth path would take us up to 5% of sustainable aviation fuel by 2030. So for now, BA is cutting down the weight of their in-flight magazines, and Bristol Airport claims to be carbon neutral already. Just ignore the flights. We heard about this before. PR departments, again, of high emissions companies like airports really depend on us not understanding the most important facts. My third point. Recent technical and social trends have shown that less travel is possible. Zoom calls like this one are enabling more businesses and social engagement without emissions. There are excellent low carbon alternatives, such as the Channel Tunnel, and people fly out of Bristol Airport more on holiday than they fly in, draining the region of income. My fourth point, climate science is still catching up. And I think this is crucial, and I haven't heard this mentioned today. If you look at the iterations of the Ipcc reports, climate change, climate breakdown is progressing on each of the successive worst case scenarios. This year, at least 205 people in Germany died. This summer, in one event, 176 are still missing and may never have been found. This was due to a single rainfall event in July 2021. Water levels here in the Netherlands reached a level during this event that was not expected until 2050. This is a fact. The UK is at similar risk of intense heat and flooding, and the impacts and costs. When you consider these issues, the cratering of youth mental health, the fantasy schemes of aviation companies, the changing communications and travel patterns, and the disaster economics of more carbon emissions, the case for Bristol Airport expansion seems rather dead to me. Please reject the plans, and thank you for the opportunity to share my views.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, in the room then we have Astrid Fort, please.
My name is Astrid Vort. I'm 10 years old and I live in Bristol. I am here today to talk about our airport. As soon as I heard that it was possible to say my views on the airport expansion publicly, I was raring to go. The reason is I'm worried that Bristol Airport are putting profit before our planet. Climate change isn't a fantasy. We see effects of it every day, whether it's on the news, far away, or unfolding beneath our eyes. You've probably all heard on the news that extreme weather events have increased by 5-fold in the last 50 years. But the problem is, adults don't seem to be doing anything about it. In fact, some are doing more harm to the planet than good. So what are we doing even thinking about a huge expansion to the airport of a tiny city? It's ridiculous. Except it isn't just ridiculous, it's terrifying. When I'm an adult, my generation is to clear up all this mess the existing adults of today will have created. And why even travel when most of Bristol Airport's holiday destinations are suffering from natural disasters? For example, Greece, France, Spain, Italy, Turkey and the USA are suffering from wildfires. Lots of North America have a heat dome, and Germany has had its catastrophic floods. With more passengers also comes more traffic and more pollution. So if there are more cars at the airport, that means more parking spaces. But less than 0.1% of the current spaces at Bristol Airport are plug-ins for electric cars, and at least another 3,000 spaces would be added in. Don't forget, this isn't being built on some magic freshly laid tarmac land. It's greenbelt land, tons of luxurious fields. What's more, pollution levels in Bristol are already exceeding UK government limits, so it really doesn't make sense to have a bigger airport. The airport states the expansion will aim to be carbon neutral by 2030, but that doesn't include any of the air or road traffic to and from the airport. They know, Bristol Airport know what they're saying is absolute nonsense. They just want to make more money. People often say that we're to see zero-emission aeroplanes in the future, and the government actually put a date on that, saying that it was 2035, when there isn't even a prototype for them yet. Show me your electric aeroplanes, then I might think about this expansion of yours. I would love to travel I would love to travel the world in a plane free of emissions, and I hope that one day my dream can be fulfilled. I love flying and think that it's amazing it's possible, but now I've told my parents I will boycott it because I've realized it is bad for the planet. The best thing we can do for the planet right now is just not do any more. I know this isn't my decision to make, but for the people it is. Before you go to bed tonight, just think about your duty to protect the futures of all the children in the world so that we can live our lives safely without having to worry from one day to the next, whether a natural disaster will kill us or our families, or if we'll have enough food. And if you do turn this down, you could change the course of history. Other bigger airports may think twice about their expansions. Which side do you want to be on, planet or profit?
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'll just go through. Okay, thank you. Next then, via Teams, have we got a Suzanne Hetherington with us?
Yep, hi, that's me. Hang on. Can you see me?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. Code Red for humanity. Let's just let that sink in for a moment. The alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. We face a direct existential threat. Or in the words of Sir David Attenborough, a sixth mass extinction is well underway. Our Garden of Eden will be lost. I wish I wasn't involved in this struggle. I wish I wasn't there. I too wish I wasn't involved in this struggle, and I wish I wasn't here. I wish I didn't have to be here in this virtual room. And I wish I didn't have to do this all over again, filling my heart with grief once more for our lost Eden. Watching the video link to the debate in these chambers in February last year, the slowly dawning realisation that our brave councillors had had the courage and willingness to face the irrefutable evidence and come to the only possible decision about the proposed expansion of Bristol Airport made me weep. Not only with grief for our planet, but also with tears of relief that at least in the face of the truth about our climate and ecological crisis, This one small battle had been won, and in that maybe there was a tiny seed of hope. So I'm deeply saddened to have to be here today, and I feel really angry on behalf of all those local residents and campaigners who have had to spend hundreds of hours re-immersing themselves in all this pain and to be faced yet again with the effects that expansion would bring locally of even more pollution, traffic congestion and disturbed sleepless nights. So I'm sorry if it's repetitive, but maybe the airport could have listened more carefully the first time. It is truly a travesty of local and national democracy that in the face of a planetary emergency, we have to be here at all. The science really is quite simple. The Earth's atmosphere has a finite volume. It is a closed system, and the more CO2 we add to the system, the more concentrated it becomes. Reducing emissions slows the rate of build-up, but does not stop it. Emissions need to be cut by 50% this decade if warming is to be limited to 1.5 degrees. And yet they are set to rise this year by the second biggest annual rise in history. If the current trend continues, the world is headed towards a catastrophic temperature rise of around 4 degrees. That is pretty much an uninhabitable planet. A sixth, our own mass extinction. Already at just 1 degree rise, we see nearly half the world's children, 1 billion children, living in countries where their lives are at extreme risk due to water scarcity and heat waves. By 2070, 3 billion people could live in places as hot as the Sahara. That is an increase of from less than 1% of the Earth's land surface today to almost 20%. The famine, misery and worldwide unrest that would involve is nothing short of apocalyptic. And for sure, it is not a world in which we will be flying around for recreation and holidays. Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan, the owners of Bristol Airport, state on their website that climate change is the greatest challenge faced by the modern world. We can play a critical role in addressing climate. We are committing to net zero by 2050. Well, for starters, 2050 is clearly too late. Currently, the share of global emissions from aviation are estimated to be around 2.5% and are set to triple by 2050. But as I'm sure you've heard, due to their release at high altitude plus avgas and particulate emissions, the EU Aviation Safety Agency believe their real warming effect to be 3 times higher than current estimates. Even the most optimistic projection of emission savings due to new fuel efficiencies are, according to the International Civil Aviation Organization, 1.3% per annum. And demand is expanding at 3% annually. So that results in a net increase. Carbon capture and storage is as yet a speculative and unproven technology. It is still in its embryonic stage of development and is decades away from making a meaningful impact. At its current rate of expansion, aviation would require a whole 2/5 of the UK's negative emissions reductions, and it's preposterous to even suggest that such reductions would be used in such a way. Biofuels have to be grown somewhere, and the land required would need to cover an area 1 or 2 times the size of India to achieve a 50% chance of us staying below 2 degrees warming. And for sure, this land will need to be used for food, not biofuels. Net zero for aviation is a fantasy. Furthermore, the OTPP transition plan covers only their share of scope 1 and 2 emissions of the companies they invest in. For the airport, this simply means that only those emissions from their buildings, their energy use, and some airport vehicles are counted. Even if scope 3 emissions were included, they would only actually cover aeroplane emissions from takeoff and landing. Their plan is predicated on false accounting, fairy tales, and greenwash. So what if aviation emissions were properly and justly accounted for? What is the true cost of flying, with particular reference to the UK? Airlines currently benefit from tax breaks worth around double what is raised by air passenger duty. And whilst tax on petrol averages around 65% of the pump price, there is none on aviation fuel. Clearly, the polluter is not paying yet. Europe and the US, which is around 15% of the world population today, are responsible for a full 53% of total atmospheric carbon emitted since 1750. And it is just a tiny 1% of world population which cause 50% of commercial aviation emissions, whilst 80% have never flown at all. So we have a massive problem with accountability and responsibility. Last week, an open letter from the British Medical Journal, published in over 200 health journals worldwide, stated, "The greatest threat to global public health is the continued failure of world leaders to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees and to restore nature. Equity must be at the centre of the global response. Reduction commitments must account for the cumulative historical contribution each country has made to emissions. Wealthier countries will have to cut emissions more quickly. Developed nations will need to reduce their footprint by a factor of 30 to stay in line with Paris Agreement targets." Incredibly, however, emissions from international flights are not counted towards any particular country. And because of that, they are not counted or allocated towards an individual country's goals in the Kyoto or Paris agreements. If we allocate per capita emissions from the country of departure and adjust the figures for the ratio of inbound to outbound travellers, we would see that the UK, where locals travel to elsewhere much more frequently, per capita emissions leap from around 422 to 818 kilograms. This ranks the UK in the top 5 per capita emitter for aviation and higher even than the United States. So what of the true cost of flying? An extensive body of research this year, which summarised over 139 studies and covered more than 700 estimates, concludes that the negative externalities, that is to say, the hidden social, environmental and health costs of the transport sector, totals a whopping £9.3 trillion annually. Based simply on their share of emissions, that would make aviation responsible for somewhere in the region of £1 trillion. And again, if we account for the ratio of inbound to outbound travellers, that would leave the UK with a responsibility of costs to people and planet with a figure in excess of £66 billion. Imagine what the UK aviation business model would look like if the true cost of negative externalities had to be factored in. In this year's BBC Reith Lectures, Canadian and ex-Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, speaks of the need for a whole economy transition in which everyone will have to adjust their business models to completely rethink market economics such that individual actions can no longer drive social disasters like the climate crisis. The UK Future Industrial Strategy Research Group this year said, if the British economy is to hit net zero by mid-century, the aviation industry faces rapid contraction, with all aviation activity phased out within 30 years and all British airports except Glasgow and Heathrow shut down by 2030. I end with a short quote from Mark Carney. The world is waking up and change is coming, whether you like it or not. There, with the clarity and certainty of youth, Greta Thunberg was telling us that we were failing. He goes on, society won't settle for worthy statements followed by futile gestures. It won't settle for countries announcing plans in Paris 5 years ago for 2.8 degrees warming, far too high, that they don't even meet. Society won't settle for companies that preach green but don't manage their carbon footprints. or financial institutions who can't tell us whether our money is on the right or wrong side of climate history. So please, for yourselves, your children and your grandchildren, for children everywhere, find your moral compass, reject this appeal and stand on the right side of history.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much as well. Thank you.
Okay. Grant Mercer, who's on Teams.
Thanks, Claire. Hello, inspectors. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. I speak to you from the not so beautiful storeroom of my business in Clifton Village. The business's name is Smaller Footprints. It's an anti-waste shop which enables people to avoid single-use packaging. I would like today to read out a letter which has been co-signed by 110 Bristol business leaders. That's 110 with not much resource put in. I didn't recognise any duplicates with Mr. Ferguson's efforts. Before I do so, I'd like today to say that I'm acutely aware that, objectively, cutting out single-use plastic from your life pales into insignificance compared to a decision to stop flying. 4 years I've been working on and running Smaller Footprints, but I know all of my efforts and the willingness of the community to use it wholeheartedly would be dwarfed by a decision to allow Bristol Airport to expand, which is a reality that I accept because it's true. I personally feel that it's impossible to live sustainably in any practical sense whilst continuing to fly. We move on to the letter now, which I didn't author. I apologise for there is a little bit of repetition with what's been said today, but it's not a long letter, so it shouldn't take long. Dear inspectors, the science is indisputable. We must decrease our carbon emissions immediately whilst reducing our consumption of the Earth's resources. Consecutive reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have advised us of the urgent need for far-reaching and unprecedented changes to all aspects of society. The government has accepted the 6th carbon budget, which will require deep cuts in carbon emissions between now and 2035. The Committee on Climate Change has advised them that this will require no net increase in UK airport capacity. The fact that the UK Parliament and many local authorities, including North Somerset, Bristol, Bath and North East Somerset and Wecker, have declared climate emergencies demonstrates the importance of this issue and the national and local intentions to address it. We, the undersigned, are businesses who recognise the importance and urgency of the climate and ecological emergencies that we face. Reduction of carbon emissions and other sustainability practices have become the norm in the ways that we work, and they are integrated into how we run our businesses and the decisions that we make. We also recognise that good business, profitability and growing the economy do not have to be in conflict with reducing our carbon emissions or improving our environmental sustainability. In fact, we have found the opposite. Being sustainable can be good for our businesses, as so many businesses in and around the Bristol area have proved. We want our businesses to grow and for the local, national and international economies to thrive, and we see ourselves as a part of that. It is with this in mind that we write to you asking that the application by Bristol Airport to expand in this appeal is rejected. Any expansion of Bristol Airport will push us ever further towards climate and ecological breakdown. Just to be clear, we do not want Bristol Airport to close. We do think it's big enough. The airport's expansion plans involve 2 million extra passengers a year, resulting in up to 1 million extra tonnes of CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions. These emissions will instantly wipe out any savings that we are achieving by our actions, not to mention dwarf Bristol's proposed reductions. These greenhouse gas emissions are totally incompatible with the changes that we local businesses make to meet the challenges of the climate and ecological emergencies. We have further grave concerns regarding loss of green belts, increases in localised road traffic, air and noise pollution, and all of the effects of these on environmental and human health. We are writing to you to state categorically that Bristol Airport must not be allowed to expand further. Such an expansion would contravene our international, national and local obligations and undermine entirely all of the work that we are doing as local businesses to reduce our collective carbon footprint. The airport argues that local business want expansion, but we believe that a significant number of local businesses do not. Please reject this application. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have seen your letter. What we hadn't seen was the details of the names of the businesses. So perhaps if you could provide those, I don't need to go through them now, but if you could just provide them just so we can have an understanding of the types of business that have signed that letter.
Sure.
Okay,
I'd be happy to read them now, but you probably want to crack on.
Yes, we do, but thank you, and we'll get that in writing. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, Britt Taylor, also via Teams.
Hello there.
Hello.
Thank you for this opportunity to address the inquiry. My name is Britt Taylor, and my family and I live at the quarry on Rodiate Hill, Bristol Road, which is the A370, in Congressbury. Whilst I'm privileged to be located in such an environmentally and socially conscious rural community, my property is also the site of the Congressbury noise mast, and we are directly under the flight path. I would like to state that I strongly object to Bristol Airport's proposal for expansion. I would like to confirm that my objections are significant, but for the purpose for today, not being repetitive and considering the time constraints, I'm only going to discuss three. One, the imminent climate crisis we're currently facing. I am not alone, obviously, and I want to see both elected and unelected officials being held accountable for taking bold climate actions that meet our collective goals of a cleaner and greener future. Two, traffic congestion. Currently, during some rush hours, at weekends, and definitely bank holidays, we have standing traffic outside our house on the A370. Quite a few times, and without any roadworks, it's backed all the way to Chelvey Batch in Backwell. It's a nightmare. Additionally, the A370 is a dual carriage road. There are no bus lanes. As a parent to two teenagers who depend on this bus service to get to and from school, to do school activities, to meet their friends, to get to their jobs, this is a mess. The buses cannot alter their route when traffic is at a standstill, and even if they could, it would be very unwise for them to venture onto the narrow country lanes. So my children, and scores of other children, their classmates, who also take the bus, get stuck, they miss out, they're late. Our public transport system clearly cannot cope with the current conditions. So please understand that as a resident, I cannot fathom how these roads will be able to cope with any expansion of current airport levels. And by current, I'm referring to the 8 million that we're currently at. As increased passengers will only increase traffic. Additionally, I believe that it's been pointed out to this inquiry that there's been substantial housing development taking place, and that this has and will further increase road traffic. So whatever excess the planning committees may have determined or considered that our roads could handle when approving these housing projects, that capacity, that excess is gone. Housing was clearly a priority, and there's simply nothing left for the likes of Bristol Airport or any expansion in the current numbers. My third point, noise disturbance and health and mental well-being. My family and I live in a newly renovated barn conversion. Much of our space is single story. It was completed in the last few years. It's architect designed and up to modern building standards. We have double glazing and well-insulated walls and a roof. They have excellent thermal properties. And yet, whilst inside our house with the windows closed, we hear the planes as they fly over. They pause our conversations. They are a part of our family meals and conversations. So firsthand, I can verify that the insulation intended to insulate our homes and provide thermal properties is neither soundproofing nor sound absorbing, nor are they intended to be. And it does not mitigate the effects of airplane noise. I looked, but I was not able to find any studies by Bristol Airport that gave reasons as to why they felt offering some of the properties in the surrounding community, not myself, but some of the properties clearly have been offered a subsidy for increasing insulation levels or double glazing. I don't quite understand why they thought, or how they thought, or what the science behind that was for that, how that would be effective in mitigating their noise. Sadly, I have little doubt that, like my house, all of these new houses which have been built in the last couple of years and are in development now will have the same problem I have. A house with excellent thermal properties, but poor acoustic properties in relation to the noise generated by jet engines. On this point, we have yet to live in our home during a peak summer season, and this is at circa 8 million passengers. But I can say I'm dreading it. I've been watching and listening to these processions remotely, and I wish I could have counted the amount of times I heard the verb or adjective of quiet used in this discourse. And just to be clear, the use of any form of quiet is offensive. There is nothing quiet about a jet engine, or quieter about a jet engine. And as intended, perhaps, it minimizes the genuine disturbance felt by any and all of us in its path. I would like to share my family's and community's experience of 2 of the mornings of the week prior. The first is on Friday, September 10th. This is a weekday where people in my house are working, possibly need to go to school. This is our morning agenda, courtesy of Bristol Airport. 6:59 a.m. we hear a flight. 7:01 a.m. 7:05 a.m. 7:16 a.m. 7:20 a.m. 7:26 a.m. 7:29 a.m. 7:31 a.m. 7:36 a.m. For my own sanity, I gave up after that point. Then the next date that I chose to do the same on was Saturday, September 11th. Now this is a weekend morning, a day that we're all meant to have a bit of respite, a bit of relaxation, maybe a lie-in. Again, this was our morning agenda, courtesy of Bristol Airport. 6:42 a.m. we hear a flight. Again at 6:52, again at 6:58, again at 7:10, 7:12, 7:14, 7:16, 7:20, and 7:26. At this point, I gave up and got up. So please consider that this schedule of Bristol Airports does not allow my family to have a healthy night's sleep. That this occurred during a relatively slow time in September, while school's in session, most holidays are over, and we're at less than, I believe, 8 million, circa 8 million passenger numbers. And whilst the airport is still in possible recovery and far below what perhaps would be their typical passenger numbers, and it by no means comes even close to representing what's permitted during peak seasons, and this is at their current 8 million passengers. I do not want to reiterate too much of what's been said, but my key points are that aircrafts are loud, they are disturbance, they are relentless, and there is no respite. I'm not a politician, I'm not a lawyer, I'm a pragmatist. The elephant in the room, and by room I mean community, is simply that we should not be here discussing any increases. In 2011, North Somerset Planning were exceptionally generous in granting Bristol Airport's planning application, allowing them to operate completely during anti-social hours and expanding to 10 million passengers. Clearly not a remit for a regional airport. Inspectors, please read the room, and again, by room I mean community, local and global. Times have changed, and we need to adapt and quickly. You need to undo what you've done. What we should be discussing here is how you're going to rescind and how you're going to reduce what was allowed to happen in 2011. And this is clearly our only sustainable solution. The time is now. So I implore you, represent your community, be bold, and be on the right side of history. Thank you for this opportunity to present my evidence.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, 3 more to go. Do we want a 5-minute? Yeah, okay. If we can have a 5-minute comfort break, then if we come back at 25 past, and then we'll have the final 3 in-person appearances. Okay. Yeah, start again. So, sorry this is a long session today. It's broken my promise of never sitting later than 5:30 as well, but important we hear from everyone. George Oakenfold, please.
Hello.
Hello.
My name is George Oakenfold. I'm a Bristol resident. Thank you very much for allowing us the opportunity to speak to you this evening. During this process, you'll have heard many expert testimonies. This is not one of them. I'm no expert. But then again, I don't have to be to see the devastation that uncontrolled climate change is wreaking across the world. Fires, floods, drought, winds. No need to recapitulate any more on that, except to note their acceleration, both in their frequency and their severity. We are in a phase of acceleration, so we must accelerate our responses to avert the threat of greater catastrophe. For each such event reduces to some extent the ability of our Earth to recover. They are harbingers of worse to come and the pain and suffering that follows them. I believe it is part of Christian belief that God, however you conceive him to be, bequeathed to us, humankind, the stewardship of this beautiful, miraculous, intricate and generous world that we inhabit. The guardianship of nature, the protection of the environment. We have failed in that duty. We are failing. And I believe we are perilously close to irredeemable failure. I'm ashamed of how selfish and careless, wasteful and self-indulgent we have become. And I'm lost in total incomprehension, bafflement and frustration at how so many influential people in all walks of life can blithely disregard the consequences of their actions. How, in the face of climate breakdown, for the sake of some comparatively petty and temporary gain, financial or political, they can somehow compartmentalize their thought and willfully close their minds to the ever-worsening destruction climate mayhem is causing, and somehow imagine that it won't be visited upon their own children as it is upon the rest of humanity. All life, in fact. We've had warnings about global warming for 50 years or more. We have wasted time. Unfortunately, inertia raised its worthless head. Perhaps we all have some tendency towards it, especially as we get older, even our leaders. It is more comfortable to bump along in the way we have become accustomed than to change our ways. Too bad. There's a definition of insanity which is just a ticket for right now. It's to keep on doing the same thing and yet expect a different result. We have faced crises before, quite recently terrorist threats in our cities, for example. Our spokesmen typically and commendably say, we must carry on as before. Don't let them win. Prove to them that they cannot change our way of life. The environmental crisis we are now facing is not like that. Fine words and rhetoric will not influence the climate. The scientific consensus is that in order to restrict the global temperature to a livable, that is a survivable 1.5 centigrade, or something close to it, we must reduce our carbon emissions to net zero. That is 51 billion tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions, mainly CO2, per annum across the globe to zero. It sounds impossible. It is a matter of sorrow. If we are to have any chance at all, we must all of us adapt to the new realities. Supporters of this airport's expansion may say that whatever Bristol Airport does is of little consequence on a global scale. 2 million extra passengers a year. That's 5,500 extra passenger movements per day, 365 days a year. Insignificant on a global scale? Maybe, maybe not. But that's not the point. We are here and now. It is the problem you and all of us are facing here and now. You have, the inspectorate, again on a global scale and with all due respect, a small yet significant decision to make. To my mind, there comes a moment when we just have to say no. No more, not one extra flight. Arrange your lives as best you may. If we don't say that, who will? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, Alison Allen, please.
Hello there. I'm a retired primary school lead for a Bristol education business charity. I'm here to draw your attention to the plight of the children, parents and teachers at Parsons Street Primary School in Bedminster, Bristol. Just to give you a picture, Ofsted says Parsons Street School requires improvement. That means it's on the way down, it's going to hit the buffers soon. It's hardly surprising when you read the pupil stats. 21.3% English not their first language, 32% free school meals, 16% special educational needs, but only the same pupil-teacher ratio, 19:1, as comparable local primaries with no special needs in their cohorts. This school can't attract teachers. The school is surrounded on two sides with 2 and 4 lanes of traffic, respectively. The playground and buildings are a good drop below the pavement level, so are perfectly positioned to receive the maximum detriment from traffic pollution. Across the road, 100 yards diagonally, is a further source of pollution, Parsons Street Station, running diesel trains. We all know about diesel. Now add to that the inevitable increase in traffic with an expanded flight schedule at Bristol Airport. People drive past the school to access the ring road to the airport in either direction. Poor School has mounted placards on both its road-facing fences to motorists, begging them to switch off their engines. Fat chance. I observed it was routinely ignored. What chance do Parsons Street Primary's 444 children have when they are not only under the flight path of air traffic, but have to breathe the fumes of cars and lorries servicing an expanded airport? I do wonder how the school is expected to implement COVID ventilation measures to get fresh air to children. The expansion of Bristol Airport can only make this already unacceptable situation worse, and naturally, I'm against it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Emma Green.
Hello, my name is Dr. Emma Geen, and I'm here on behalf of the Bristol Disability Equality Forum, where I work at the intersection of disability and climate issues. Thank you to the inspectors for the opportunity to speak on this important and often overlooked issue. And thank you for sticking around for so long to give me the opportunity. On July 15th, in Sinzig, Germany, 12 disabled people were sleeping in the care home where they lived when the Aha River broke its banks and flooded. All had severe impairments, and as the water began to rush into the room, many of them were unable to leave their beds. As the water rose up the walls to the ceiling, all were unable to climb to the second floor above the flood level, and all 12 drowned. This is just one example of disabled people dying from a climate-related disaster, but the list goes on, because disabled people are twice more likely to lose their lives or be injured than any other person during disasters. And the frequency and severity of disasters will only increase as society continues to make high-emission infrastructure and policy decisions. The expansion of Bristol Airport is the most important decision of this sort that we are faced with in the South West. And to proceed with expansion would be committing to a world where disabled people suffer, die, and see their rights further eroded. The United Nations recognise disabled people as being a group that is and will be disproportionately impacted by climate change. Alongside the increased threat presented by climate disasters, systemic disadvantages mean that many people in the disabled community do and will struggle to adapt or escape the consequences of the crisis. The lack of accessible resources on climate issues means that many of us are not fully informed. The exclusion from decision-making process means that disability issues often aren't considered, and new barriers are created. Lack of suitable housing leaves many living in hazardous locations that are susceptible to natural disasters. Food poverty, which according to the Council's own data is already 3 times higher in the Bristol disabled community than the average, will worsen with climate-driven crop failures. Over 3/4 of Bristol disabled population of working age are economically inactive, compared to just 1/4 of those not disabled. Unemployment means that many will lack the economic resources to adapt to the challenges that climate change throws at them. The climate crisis will also worsen the health conditions that many disabled people suffer from. We've heard quite a few times today already about the mental health problems that are presented by the crisis, and many of those will be severe enough to be considered disabilities. Moreover, severe hay fever and forest fires will aggravate the breathing of those with respiratory conditions. Increased heat waves will put many under great stress. My mother, who, like myself, was a disabled woman, suffered from multiple sclerosis and was susceptible to attacks during heat waves. Intense heat floored her, softening her psychiatrist's brain and swimmer's body. And I often wonder how she would have survived the summers to come in an age of climate chaos. And I suspect the answer is that she wouldn't have. Airport expansion will also contribute to the creation of new disabled people. Globally, climate disasters are a significant cause of permanent impairments. According to the World Disasters Report, for every child killed by a natural disaster, 3 become impaired. Conditions such as malnutrition and malaria, which the World Health Organization reports are already on the rise due to climate change, also often lead to disabilities. But locally, and more directly, Bristol Airport expansion would drive up air pollution from traffic and flights. In my job, I have talked to people who have at times been unable to leave the house or had daily panic attacks due to the dirty air in Bristol, and it is killing people. Research in the Review of Economic Studies find that respiratory diseases are 17% higher and cardiac problems 9% higher among those living within 6.2 miles of a major airport. In Bristol alone, the council's own data shows that air pollution contributes to 300 deaths per year. Every one of these people is disabled by air pollution before they die. While disabled people are among the most at risk in the face of climate change, we are among the least responsible. Disabled people are not frequent flyers. The Independent reports that in 2018, only 36% of disabled people took a flight, compared to over half of the general population. This is in part because many of the community are priced out of flying, but it's also in part because of those who can afford to fly often find that airlines are inaccessible and unfriendly to disabled passengers, particularly those with wheelchairs. So we're paying the price without reaping any kind of benefit. I'd like to close with a reminder that disability shouldn't be considered as a niche concern. At least 16.75% of Bristol's population are disabled, and that figure climbs to over 85% in over 85-year-olds. At the Bristol Disability Equality Forum, we often refer to people without impairments as the not yet disabled. It is an inevitable fact of life that with the march of age, everyone present here today will experience their body becoming increasingly vulnerable and fragile. And eventually, whether tomorrow or in 50 years, the majority of you will eventually join me in becoming a disabled person. And the decisions you make now will shape the world that we grow old in. And if you choose a present in which high-emission projects are allowed to proceed, then we will face a future that will be increasingly threatening to those who aren't able-bodied. The expansion of Bristol Airport must not go ahead. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Thank you, and my apologies for getting your name wrong at the start, Dr. Geen. Okay, thank you. And thank you for sticking around as well. So you're the last person today, so thank you very much. Okay. All right, thank you, everyone. We shall reconvene tomorrow at 9:30. Thank you.